Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And we have quite a bit of ground to cover. A little bit more than last episode, at least in terms of the number of topics, because I know last episode we spent going deep into a few topics, and I do have a little bit more of a spread right now. Of course, quite a bit of news out of Ukraine that we'll cover, the Kursk front as well, some internal news in Russia, uh, the Durov case, his arrest in France, plenty of news out of the Middle East, a little bit in East Asia, and I definitely want to focus on some European news, especially in Serbia, with some of the things going on there. But without further ado, I'll hand it right over to you to just give us some
Okay,
frontline updates.
sure. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you to Dimitri and Conrad of the World War Now YouTube channel. I was on their show last week. I believe the show should be coming out soon, probably on Substack first, but then on YouTube. So look for that.
Oh,
It
definitely.
was really enjoyable. And there was a young man named Isaac of Palestinian descent who was on the show with us. So it was a very fruitful recording. It was very good. Anyways, my gratitude to Dima, especially for having me on. So let's begin with the frontline news. There's a lot. Um, I want to cover beginning with Zaporozhye and the Rabotina front. So that's the first image, the first slide. As you can see, the Russians outlined in lilac, that's the ground that they retook, I believe, about a week ago, and now directly north of it and northwest of it, you can see that they've taken yet more ground. So they've gone back to where it was roughly around 2022. And, all those men, all that material that didn't materialize into anything. Um, Moving east, right on the border between Donetsk and Zaporozhye, is the Vermevsky Ledge. First slide is like a general overview. You can see how vast this area is. Some small gains in the last week. Again, the lilac is older, the red is newer. The slide below that one is a close-up. The Russians, of course, have taken Staromayorsk and Urozhanye, and they're pushing their way over to Makrovka. So there's another 3-4 villages for them to climb before they get to where they were in 2022, 2023, before the Ukrainian summer offensive. But this is not like a high priority for them. A much higher priority would be the Ugledar direction, and that's our next slide, which links basically the southern front with the eastern front. And you can see that in the last week, the Russians have had lots of gains, and they're building on those gains, particularly to the northeast of it. You see that territorial gain. That is a highway that links Ugledar with Konstantinovka. This is not the Konstantinovka around Chasov Yar, Bakhmut, no, or north of Toretsk. No, this is the Konstantinovka that is south of Krasnogorovka. So next slide will show you kind of like a close-up of the area of Ugledar and one of the mines close to it. You can see the Russians have completely crossed over the highway. So this is an area that there is growing suspicion that they're going to give it up. Now, the Ukrainians have defended this area extremely well. Um, Zooming back out, you can see in the third slide, you can see where Ugledar is situated. And the lilac color, this is current, this is today. Thus, the consolidated gains that the Russians have made in the last 24 to 48 hours. Uh, I believe it's either the 72nd or the 73rd Brigade, which is an elite brigade, very well seasoned, very knowledgeable about the area and how to hamstring and repel the Russians. You remember in February of 2023, the Russians were devastated. I mean, they lost 12 to 16 armored vehicles, dozens of men, and it came to nothing. But part of the problem was they were not attacking where you see these gains are. And the 72nd or 73rd Brigade has been taken out. It is, as of today, according to one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, they are being moved to Kursk. Kursk is the big front, the big issue, even if it's been semi-static for the last week. These last 2 days, the Ukrainians have managed to make some small gains, including taking 2 towns yesterday. We're recording on August 30th, the Friday. So I'm talking about gains that they made yesterday. The 5 previous days, there were no gains, according to Deep State Map. So, but to return to Ugledar, Ugledar is an interesting place. You know what? Ignore the map that you see.
The fourth one down.
The map, yeah, the one in color. You can show that. That is Vodyane. This is a town about 1/3 of the way from Ugledar to Konstantinovka. And you can see how close the Russian troops are to Vodyane. And this is a village. There's only a few buildings that are like high rises. I'm going to send you. I forgot, Constantine. I'm sorry. I forgot to send you. I had a really great picture. I'm going to send it to you right now. It's at the bottom of the list and of slides, way at the bottom. And this gives you kind of an idea of why Ugledar is so difficult to take. As you can see, it is almost all high rises entirely. Across the highway are some dakias. Now, the Russians ended up being able to occupy this area for several weeks, even over a month, but they couldn't hold on to them and they had to retreat. Very brutal fighting here, and actually large losses on both sides, as I remember the Russians discovering an area with like 8 to 10 Ukrainian bodies. But so the Russians eventually had to forgo any plans to take Ugledar. Now, if they took it, it would have been incredible. You know, one of their armored units actually made it into the town proper before it was repelled or destroyed. I can't remember, honestly. It's been a year and a half. So that is the story with Ugledar. The Russians are, I think, going to go for it. And if they take it, that's when you're going to see a push towards the Vermevsky Ledge, where they're going to go past Staromayorsk, right? Now, the next front I want to get into is the South Donetsk. And I only have one slide. This is an area just south of Donetsk city. You can consider it a separate area. The craziest thing about this is that the Russians captured Konstantinovka. Now you can see the red outline is where they took territory today, but the previous day they took the entire town. This was crazy because last week they had a toehold, and then in about 4 or 5 days, well, the line went kind of static, and then they just took the whole thing in like one day after a small toehold in it. That to me tells me that the Ukrainians are probably going to give up the Donbass. Um, and you're going to see similar stories or similar deductions that you can make based on the lack of men that they have to defend these areas. Part of that problem is that a lot of their best elite units that could counterattack. Remember a few months ago where I was basically outlining how it is that the Ukrainians defend territory?
Yes.
They have their territorial forces now. Yes, some of them are conscripts, but some of them are also very good. They have a lot of experience in the Kupiansk area, for instance. They've been very successful. Nonetheless, these units still depend on very well trained younger men with the latest NATO equipment, or NATO equipment that is comparable or better than Soviet equipment. Okay, so for Konstantinovka to fall that quickly, honestly, was a surprise. But we're going to hear similar stories when we get to Pokrovsk. And the next slide is Pokrovsk. This overview, if people recall last week, you can see what I was saying earlier last week was that the Russians would focus on going south, and we were going to see why that is. But now the front is very broad, and the Russians are now well under 10 kilometers from central Pokrovsk, not the outskirts, but central. So they're moving very quickly. And part of the reason for this is, I believe even the 47th Brigade, which has been an effective brigade, it's been fighting the Russians since the days of Avdiivka. So for 9 or 10 months, they've been fighting, generally in this area. They're the ones also who've lost, like, a lot of the Bradleys and Abrams. And incidentally, this week, the 21st Abrams was destroyed a couple of days ago. But that was in the Kursk region. So if we go to the next slide, we can get into some of the details. The first detail is of the northern push. This is interesting because there's a lot of fortifications here, and the fortifications are located on high ground. You can see that the Russians are utilizing the railway tracks, as they have been for a long time. And you can see the two terra mounds that they have, the Ukrainians had, as a way to have, like, superior vantage point. These are not easy places to take. The Russians are utilizing a lot of FPV drones on a constant basis so that storming operations aren't as deadly for Russian troops. Nonetheless, you can see that the Russians have managed to work their way to Mykolaiivka. Krasny Yar is another small village that they took. A lot of this they've taken very quickly, and as a kind of surprise to everybody, to be honest. One of the towns that fell very quickly was Novogorodka. Novogorodovka is south of the region that I'm talking about. And it happened, again, this was another town that fell in about 3 days. So again, very quick succession. So if we go to the third slide in this series, we can see that the Russians have moved into Seledove. They have control probably about 30% of the town, but notice that yesterday they took over 2 terra mounds, or terracons, and this is the town that is just south of Novogorodka. So this is a considerable amount of progress. Something like 75 square kilometers in this direction have been taken by the Russians. If we go to the next slide, we'll get a zoomed-in view of Selodove. As you can see, that the Russians have taken the Dachias in the east, and they have a fairly good foothold in the town and are basically in the center. In the northwest, you can see that there are, and in the center itself, the Russians are going to encounter high rises. They may flank to the south, is my guess. Only because it would be better to do that than to go directly against the high rises. Again, you can see to the north that the earth mounds, the earthworks, as it were, from all the mining that happens in Donetsk. The Russians took over them very quickly. And the next slide, you know what? Yeah, you can show the next slide. It's fine. This gives you an overview of that southern flank. One of the interesting things is the Russians took over the village of Karlovka, and the water reservoir, the second water reservoir that you see in the center right of this image. This is important because it'll make basically supplying for the Russians in this area much easier. They won't have to loop around both waterworks or go in between them. The next slide is basically what the Russians are probably wanting to do. You can see that the basic strategy will be for the Russians to go from the South Donetsk area, Geroyevka, and link up with the Pokrovsk front that is where we were just looking at from the town of Memrik. So in this area, you can see a pocket has formed. And part of the reason the Russians can do this is Krasnogorovka fell about 3 weeks ago. This is a town that took 4 months of fighting. But now it's allowed them to make progress westwards. So the Ukrainians are finding themselves in a situation like they did in Toretsk and in New York, where there were pockets that were also smaller pockets, but pockets basically like this. And they had to evacuate them. Now, the interesting thing that the Russians did is instead of focusing all their energy on stopping the relief and the evacuation of Ukrainian troops from this pocket, they instead pushed north, where they had already been struggling, and they made gains. This is in the New York front and then the Toretsk front. And my guess is that when the Ukrainians think it's time to pull out, that's what they're going to, the Russians will do again. So look for the Russians to start moving westward from Geroyevka, and even westward from Krasnogorovka, where they can reach the other water reservoir. And of course, Jihad Julian even mentioned this on one of his Twitter posts.
Yes,
And
he's
I'll
been
read it.
blackpilling very hard lately, which
Oh
has been
yeah,
very enjoyable to watch.
yes. He's a Russian spy.
Oh, of course.
That dastardly Putler. So now the entire central Donetsk frontline sector is under threat of collapsing due to Russian forces advancing in the north and south, and hence the flanking Ukrainian units in the center. Yeah, this is kind of what I was getting at last week as well. That before you see the Russians going closer and closer to Pokrovsk, they're going to widen the breadth of this front, so that it's not going to be a salient that can easily be cornered, where they become trapped in a pocket. By doing that, of course, artillery has a difficult time stopping this salient from forming. So that's why I said they're going to move south. And if they're really ambitious, they're going to want to take care of this pocket, which has now been created from their progress to Pokrovsk. But yeah, since last week, lots of towns, lots of little villages, the Russians have taken. And then in this next one by Julian, he says the domino effect between Donetsk city and Pokrovsk continues. After losing Kalinove and Memrik, the Ukrainian army had to withdraw from another 8 square kilometers around Karlovka, where it stood steadfast against the Russians pushing from the east for months. Of course, today the Ukrainians lost Karlovka. And in the next slide, you can see how they lost it. This is from Scott's Calibrated. So that's it for the Pokrovsk front. Um, the Russians are making very good progress. And we're going to get into a little bit of the Kremenaya Kupiansk front before we kind of head back and talk about Toretsk and then finally finish off with Kursk. So looking at the first slide for Kremenaya Kupiansk, you can see that that salient that the Russians had in the Torske region has been reduced. They've made some gains around this area, as you can see. And in the far north, the Ukrainians in dark blue outline have managed to take back some territory. But the Kremenaya Svatove area is it's intense fighting from time to time, but that's not where most of the action is happening. In fact, where it's happening is further north. So that's the next slide. And this is an area that is not very far from Kupiansk. Kupiansk is in the top left-hand corner. And the Russians, this salient has been just going on and on. And honestly, I've kind of ignored this in all the episodes because, it was little by little, and then suddenly it starts to sneak up on you. And to be honest, the Russians have made big territorial gains have only happened there in the last week. So it was little small successive ones for weeks and months. But now, ever since the Kursk offensive for the Ukrainians, the Russians are making much bigger gains. And then lastly, we'll round this out. You see what's going on in Kupiansk. I've outlined that in red. You can get a better idea of where Kupiansk is now with the previous slide. And to the northeast of it, you can see that the Russians, at first I almost didn't believe this, but they've entered Sinkovka. At first they said that they took about half of it. Then another source said that they took all of it. Remember, this place has gone back and forth many times. Okay, so I don't know if the Russians can keep it. Next to it, you can see that they're flanked on their western side by their own units in that forest, but immediately southwest of them is still filled with Ukrainians, we would presume, unless they've been transferred. So we don't know for sure. But this is another pocket that the Russians have created. And, they probably want to take back Izium, which is further south. The next slide gives you a better idea. Again, it's from Scott Calibrated, showing the gains that they've made today and yesterday. The green is the most recent gain that he's been able to confirm. The slide after that is in Pishanya. If we already covered that area, that's back in further south in the Kremenaya front. The Russians just keep expanding there. And now we can move to Toretsk. So the Toretsk front, you can see that the Russians have made, just enormous gains since the beginning of July, which is when this operation started. I believe July 7th or so. So New York, of course, has been completely captured. The Russians are expanding westward. It's not certain how they're going to capture the rest of New York. But why don't we see okay, so just do me a favor, don't pop up the slide beneath this one, Konstantin. Do the one next to it, the one below it, and then we'll do the one above it.
Okay.
I'm gonna just like it so you know which one I mean. Yeah, so if we can get this one up. And this will give us an idea of the advances that the Russians have made in the Toretsk front. Incidentally, History Legend has made another really good video. He did one on Kursk last week, and he did another one a couple of days ago on the Toretsk front. What happened there? How is it that the Ukrainians lost this territory? And really, in many ways, it's the tactics that the Russians decided to use in 2024 have been, aviation and artillery. You just you destroy the city, and you just don't give your opponents a place to hide. And the one thing, one of the units that the machines, the weapon system he kept describing over and over again is the Solntsepek, the sun oven or the sun baker. You could translate. So the Russians have improved this. When the war started, they had one that could do between 2 kilometers from the front line, which is very, very close. It made them susceptible. Think back in late 2023, early 2024, the Russians lost some of them. But nonetheless, they have now created new versions that are 10 to 15 kilometers from the front. So they're less susceptible to being taken out. And these are very deadly weapon systems because they they use fire basically. They suck the air out, and it's a horrific death, to be honest. The slide above the one that I've highlighted, we can go to that one because that gives you like, well, I mean, both slides. Again, you can see the terracons. This Toretsk has a lot of terracons, and the Ukrainians have already lost at least two of them. And these earth mounds, like the ones that we saw on the Pokrovsk front, are bigger than the one in Avdiivka. So just think about that. So the slide beneath the one that says Toretsk, that's a close-up. You can see that the Russians have moved into areas, including areas that have high rises, and I'm assuming that, in fact, they even took over a hospital. Um, so I'm assuming that the next job will be to go after the the Terracon, the Earth Mound, and the forest around it. One of the reasons why the Russians have had success in this area, okay, is moving into Toretsk. There is a forest belt, and it's quite thick. Yes, the Russians softened up the Ukrainians in there with constant FPV drones, but in that Russians took New York, or were on the verge of taking all of it. And remember, there was that day that they made a 3.5 kilometer surge, very narrow, but a surge. They used the one of the pipes, and subsequently, the Russians also used a tunnel that I think they built to move 2 kilometers into Toretsk.
Yes.
So the same kind of tactics, right, that they employed in Avdiivka. Anyhow, um, so Toretsk, as I said, we already know certain elite brigades have already been moved out, and they've been moved to Kursk. The longer this goes on, the more this starts to look like an insane move by the Ukrainians. And it could be because they knew that they could only hold on for so long, and it was better to go for broke in Kursk. Uh, the Pentagon is saying, well, we might have heard one thing or another about what the Ukrainians were planning, but we weren't paying. I mean, if you believe that, I don't know what to say. But Toretsk it really could be, and it's a bigger place than Avdiivka. And as I said, it has like at least 6, 7 earth mounds. Um, it could be a place that falls by October. It's not. I wouldn't be surprised.
I can't find
Uh,
the exact figures. I've been looking for them the past few minutes, but I can't come across them. But if you look at the average ground taken by the Russians from June to July, now we're at the end of August, in the month of August, it increases exponentially from the beginning of the summer.
yes, to go from like 2, 3 kilometers a day to like 11 to 15. It's really crazy, right? Now, of course, the Ukrainians have taken nearly 1,000 kilometers in the Kursk area, and they are fighting very hard there. They're taking big losses. Yes, the Russians lost men to being taken prisoner, but then you also have lots of Ukrainian prisoners. Now it's the recruits, right? The elite units have not been able to really move very well. We can jump to the Kursk slide as we talk about this. So this gives you like an overview of the area, and just so people understand where this is situated. This is an area northwest of Kiev and adjacent to the Sumy region.
Yes, and
Now,
if you look at
uh,
like the bottom center, you can actually see the city of Sumy, and then the light blue
mhm,
line is the border between Russia and Ukraine, and then the dark blue
that's right.
territory is the incursion.
That's right. We talked on the last show that we speculated that the Ukrainians were intent on reaching Kupiansk, the Kupiansk nuclear power station. We can go to the next slide, which is a blow up slightly. Um, you can see that the Russians only had about one fortification that's in the blue area, right around Suja, and they lost Suja, I think, after the first week. Now, interestingly, all the units fighting there, except for Akhmat and one or two other units, are recruits. These are young men, and the young men that were captured. Well, I mean, you could tell they were young. You could tell these guys were definitely not older than 24. Very young guys. But according to history legends, these young lads held out in Suja for just a little over 3 days. So, considering that they're not crack units, they're just recruits, they did very well, and they themselves said that their commanders like fought to the end before they were taken prisoner. Now, it should also be mentioned that the Ukrainians, as I said, they're flowing in supplies and armaments and men and so on, and they too now you'll see videos of a dozen, 10 guys, 14 guys getting captured, 8 guys getting captured by the Russians, and some of them have started confessing that they were told when they went in that they could rape, they could steal, they could do whatever they wanted. Right, so it was a kind of terror campaign against the Russians. And in fact, this week, the second pregnant woman was killed. I also saw videos of, just pensioners like literally dead on the street. They were taken with, like, there's no big shell depression, there's no shell impact. So they were killed, obviously, with FPV drones. It's sick. Like, these are just old people.
I mean,
And
one of the first examples we have of the Ukrainian incursions into Russia proper was in Bryansk. I believe that was late 2022. And that
yes,
was the case with the two pensioners with their grandchildren, and they shot at the
yes.
car. I think one of the
The boy
grandparents,
survived.
yes,
Yes. And he saved a girl that was like 2 years older than him,
yes,
or like around his age.
yeah, because I think it was like the children were 8 and 10, either way, and then
Yes,
the pensioners were like late 60s, early 70s. I can't quite remember. I think they were both killed, but I know for a fact the boy survived because the Russian media made
that's right.
a very went through great lengths to give press coverage to this boy, like in the hospital, everything. I think his sister survived. That's what it was. But that was one of the first incursions that we had. And then we had the constant strikes on Belgorod throughout 2023, especially late 2023. Bryansk also has not been spared from this, and even going back into late 2022, Belgorod has been a frequent target of the Ukrainians as
Yeah.
well. And now
And
this
there was
is
another more shelling today.
yes, and now this is expanded into Kursk, which is a mostly rural region, especially
Yeah,
along the border. It's a lot of forest, a lot of small towns, villages, not much you can take, and as many have said, the power plant was likely the goal. And also, I
Yeah,
still maintain that just as important, if not more important, goal was delaying any sort of offensive from the north, particularly towards Sumy, which it definitely did. Now, there have been strikes in Sumy. There's been strikes across Ukraine, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes here.
yeah,
But this has been and the Ukrainians have been doing this since before the war effort looked as dire as it did now. Not that the 2022 counteroffensive was any indication that the Ukrainians would be victorious. It showed that they could put up a fight. It showed that they could drive the Russians back because the Russians were underprepared for this campaign. But even then, you still had this campaign of terror. Of course, you have had the missile and, well, more so drone strikes into Moscow. You've had the drone strikes on Pskov, which likely came from the Baltic states. That hasn't been confirmed, but looking at the flight paths, that was likely the case. And of course, there's been strikes on other strategic targets, such as oil fields in Russia as well. So none of
yes,
this is new. And look, you could say the oil fields, yeah, those actually are a strategic target. But point being is, in this quote unquote defensive war, they have been rather insistent in striking into Russian territory. And sure, you can say it's war, anything is fair game, whatever. But point being is, even if we're putting aside a lot of the stories we covered, like the shelling of Belgorod City, and I mean, this isn't even getting into the campaign that Donetsk endured for 8 years under the Ukrainian government. That's not even getting into that. But
yeah,
when we're talking about these border regions of Russia, once again, you can talk about whatever, even putting aside all the civilian casualties, even putting aside all the frankly deliberate targeting of civilians. Even the so-called strategic strikes into Russia have been to little avail. I know that they've hit some airfields, and but point being is none of this has really delayed the Russian war effort in any significant sense, nor has it delayed any frontline operations in any significant sense, and has just been a waste of manpower and resources. From the small strategic strike, and of course, the most blatant example is the map of Kursk you're looking at right now.
right. One thing I think that has to be said, I mean, there's many things to be said, but one of the things that has to be said is how, like, Western audiences, with this war, I'm not talking about the NAFOs who pay really close attention, uh, but they really are like prone to low information. And for them, oh my God, the Ukrainians might take Moscow in a month or two, right? Like, they're ever hopeful. And part of it is the kind of simulacra that the Ukrainians and particularly the West can run. There's never been a more PR war than this. You would think like um, Iraq would have been the most PR war ever. I think this takes the cake. But we'll get back to it. I just want to finish off the gains that the Ukrainians made yesterday after a 5-day pause. You know, the Russians are still holding on to Korenovo, and I think that's key. And the Ukrainians to the west of this area, around the Sam River, have not been able to penetrate, which tells you something about just how many forces the Russians have allocated to this area that were some of these new recruits. So, anyways, Cherkassy is a village that fell yesterday to the Ukrainians, and to the east, the Russians had Borky, but they lost Borky yesterday. Otherwise, no major changes in the Kursk area. Now, you and I were talking off air about, like, the ultimate strategy, and why Kursk kind of brings up some issues that let's say that Russian leadership might be at fault. Now, when the Kursk incursion happened, my suspicion, and I think I was wrong about this, was that Gerasimov messed up. But now you're hearing more and more reports that the Russians were aware of this buildup. And the ultimate decision probably was not him. And in fact, one of the reasons why he initially said that everything is stabilized after the first day, which it wasn't, is because it wasn't stabilized. And that was probably something that the Kremlin had scripted for him to say. And you recall the interview that he had with Putin, and there was no sound at all. Another very strange video to release. Like, why release a video that had no transcript? There was nothing you could hear from the conversation, but why have it? My guess is that it was probably Putin that might be the most responsible for the Kursk incursion. You know, he has been like just unbelievable. He can, I think he can be a very indecisive man, right? Maybe when he makes up his mind, he might have a certain stick to itiveness, but this was a vulnerable area that his command knew 2 weeks prior to the incursion, sometime in mid-July, that the Ukrainians were building up forces, and that the underestimation might have been him and not necessarily Gerasimov. The Duran had John Hellman on, and he basically kind of confirmed some of the things I was thinking about from the last show till now. And if you guys can catch that interview, it's from 2 days ago. I would strongly suggest watching it, because let's take, for instance, you were talking about off air, the missile launch, the missiles that flew, I think, on the 26th of August, 4 days ago.
Yes, Monday.
Yeah, and that was incredible, right? Like, I mean, almost every major city was hit. Like, you named the city,
Oh,
and it was
trust
hit.
me, I will. Just when we move on to this next segment, I have an entire list for everything that was hit. I got mapped. I got everything.
The question is Putin ready to uh, to destroy all of Ukraine's energy? Is he ready to do it this winter? He might have been able to do even more damage in 2022, when the missile launch um, campaign, basically under Sirovikin,
Yes,
started
the
in.
retaliation for the Kursk bridge. That
Yes, and something tells me that the Russians were going to do it anyways, but he stopped, right? Like, in 2023, we can say they built on their success, and there are parts of Ukraine that have severe energy shortages, everywhere from Kharkov and Poltava all the way to Lvov, right? So it's a wide area, even parts of I don't know, Ivano-Frankovsk and Odessa, Lvov. Shops have these Honda gas generators, right, to power their shops.
which, looping back around, that's what makes this current dispute with Hungary and Slovakia so important right now, especially in
Hmm.
relation to the Druzhba pipeline, which, mind you, the Druzhba pipeline passes through Kursk, and there was now it turned out to later be false, but there was reports of the Ukrainians sabotaging one of the gas transit stations there. Now they did capture it, but as far as I know, they did not sabotage it. And once again, we're coming up on that September deadline in a couple days to see what Hungary and Slovakia will do in response to that. They've already requested that Ukraine begin allowing the transit of gas through the pipeline again, oil and gas through the pipeline again. But we haven't gotten an answer on that from Zelensky. We haven't gotten an answer on that from Kiev. So, depending on how hardline Hungary and Slovakia are able to go without incurring the wrath of the European Union, because once again, Brussels is towering over them. They have a lot of tools at their disposal to make life in those countries a living hell. Uh, we'll see what this all comes to a head come September, because that is
Hmm.
the date that Orban and Zharto is warning us about. And I know that Zharto has been on his last ditch effort to actually try to talk to Gazprom, talk to the Ukrainians to begin the flow of gas again. But like I said, we're
Right.
coming up on that September deadline, so we'll see what happens, especially in relation to Ukraine's energy grid, which is why I brought it up.
And if I'm not mistaken, right, this is also the end of the contract. Remember in
Yes,
2022,
2025 is the
2025 is the end of the contract. Poland, I remember even before the SMO started, we were talking about how the end of the contract was something like November or October 2022, right? So these contracts are ending. And the Ukrainian government basically said that from now on, if you want gas, it's going to come from places like Azerbaijan. Now, the funny thing is Azerbaijan, it's gas and oil, like the Russians have a 20% share in
yeah,
it,
they took that chess piece.
right? And like, if I'm not mistaken, like they would probably be using the South Stream or the Turk Stream pipeline to do this.
Which also goes through Turkey, which, as we know, has been the great middleman not only in this conflict but a number of other conflicts as well. And
Yeah.
as it stands right now, although they're still fully willing to play both sides, and they will continue to, I guarantee you that, they're much more amenable to Russia and to
Yes.
Iran right now. Now, like I said, that can change, but as the situation stands, they are very much at odds with Europe. They're very much at odds with the West and NATO and the United States.
Right. So I guess where I'm getting at, and as soon as I finish, you can talk about all the cities that were hit. So, there's yes, there has been a buildup, but it's been very slow, and I don't know how significant it is. Because for about 2 months, there were hardly any missile launches at all, right? Here and there, but not the massive kinds of destruction that we witnessed on the 26th of August this year. So they're building up on that. But the point is Putin finally willing to like make life such a living hell? Does he think like this strategy will work? Right? There are still bridges. Like if they wanted to, they could destroy bridges so that Ukraine's resources are constantly building bridges. Like they could destroy more dams. So Hellman was basically wondering, like, is Putin, going to, is he going to react in such a way that will reflect a lot of what the Russian public is saying? Because the Russian public is furious. They're furious with what has happened in Kursk.
Well, something else you do have to keep in mind with all of this is that when it comes to talking about Putin and his options going forward for how the SMO or the wider war, if you will be conducted, is that Zelensky is past his term, so he has ruled out any negotiation with him from that. Has said that Kiev, after the incursion into Kursk, can no longer be reasoned with. And like I said, there's a number of other uh, qualifiers Putin has put out there that have all expired, which within the world of the Russian Federation, if you will, within the guidelines set forth by Russia, by Putin, by the things said by him, ignoring the opinion of the West because they're always going to wring their hands, etc., etc., the time for negotiation seems to have expired, and they offered their final peace deal a few months back. I'm sure you all remember,
Yeah.
and that was refused outright. And then all of a sudden, you have the Ukrainians talking about peace, but you've had the Russians, you've had some officials, maybe not as significant, but outright say it. But you've had plenty of officials in Russia suggest that they're seeking the complete capitulation of Zelensky and the Kiev government, and that terms of peace will now be dictated. Now, how far that will go, what they will determine, terms being dictated, what they will consider the departure of the Kiev government, that could mean a number of different things. But at this point, with what it is, especially with the half baked pledges NATO has made that once we get a ceasefire, we'll make sure that the sovereign Ukraine, as they would call it, is in NATO. They've left
Yes.
the Russians with no reason to enter negotiations, no reason to enter any sort of ceasefire, and to
Right.
seek the departure of the Kiev government, which I don't think it's going to be total war. I don't think it's going to be shock and awe. I don't even think we're going to see that rapid of an escalation. I don't know, maybe some more issues at the Belarusian border as we see troops amassing there. But I do think it is going to be this pressure campaign continued with the steady offensive that they've been going on right now that will just continue to put pressure internally within Ukraine. And that might involve further strikes on infrastructure like the ones that we saw on Monday until there is a state collapse in Ukraine, until the state becomes too dysfunctional to continue on with its daily duties in Ukraine, in which case, presumably, some caretaker government would arrive after chaos ensues. Now, how much control they would have over the country, that is up for debate. But once again, I don't think we're talking about any sort of significant state collapse, but I do think they are seeking the departure of the current Kiev government before anything happens. Now, whether that just means Zelensky leaves, whether that means him and his inner circle are cleared out, whether that means, if we go the furthest example, a complete reversal of the Maidan. Like I said, a lot of those questions are up in the air. But point being is, as it stands now, the current government in Ukraine, under its current structure, they simply have ruled out negotiation with after multiple attempts.
Yeah, and, before I go on, I just want to substantiate what I said earlier about the Russian public being upset with the maybe the way I don't want to overstate that. Obviously, that doesn't reflect everybody, but interestingly, Putin's popularity dropped from 78.5% to around 74%. So there has been a dip. Again, I don't want to overstate it, but it does bring up the question. And, we've talked about this several times in 2023. We talked about it in 2024, and that is, what if the strategy is for the Ukrainians to just literally fight for every single inch until Russia just can't do it anymore, right? Like this is the point where Putin, to stave that off, he would have to increase the pain more quickly, right? Um, but he's not. On the other hand, you could argue that this long approach has put the West in a point where their uh, manufacturing abilities cannot win the war, such as they are.
And I'll also return to some internal numbers in Ukraine because I've been meaning to bring these up. So, this year alone, 2024, there has been 37,000 cases of abandonment and desertion from the AFU. Reported, mind you, there's a lot of the ones that slip through the cracks. And then if the current trend continues, it'll be 55,000 by the end of the year, compared to 21,000 reported cases last year. And I agree with your point that there probably is a large subset of Ukraine, both in terms of the government and the people, who believe if they can make the Russians fight for every inch, if they can dig their heels in, that they can create a crisis of confidence in Moscow and Putin's government, and where the Russians just throw up their hands and give up. But on the other hand, we have to look at those numbers are just a microcosm of the mounting internal problems in the Ukraine. That when it comes to this kind of war of attrition, when it comes to the digging in of heels, I, I'm trying not to be biased here, but I think I can objectively say that the Russians have more staying power than the Ukrainians if it's going to be that kind of fight.
Yeah, I mean, in a microcosm, let's take a look at the Kursk offensive, and in terms of the kind of weapon systems that the Ukrainians have lost. Yes, a day or two ago they shelled the Kursk NPP, okay, um, with HIMARS. Now, in the last 2 weeks, the Ukrainians have lost two HIMARS and at least one M270. Now, the M270 looks just like a HIMARS, but instead of wheels, it has tracks. And instead of being able to fire 6 rockets or projectiles, it can fire 12. They've also lost another Patriot system, 2 Buk systems, an S-300 system, and we haven't seen these kind of losses since back around June, when the Ukrainians lost 4 HIMARS, finally, with visual confirmation and three Patriot systems, right? And this is kind of like what I was getting at. Like the West cannot keep up with the demand for the kind of war that Ukraine is fighting, right? Ukraine could switch to like a new tactic where it would be small arms, terrorist attacks, grenades, that kind of thing, guerrilla warfare. How much of the public is willing to do that? Like, how likely is it that, like, I don't think if Russians were forced to go all the way to Lvov, it would be like a Northern Ireland conflict. That's what it would be like there. But it won't be like that, I would say, in Donetsk and Zaporozhye. And this is where I think we get to the crux of the matter. If you look at where, like, why did the Ukrainians build so many forts? Why are they fighting so hard for Eastern Ukraine that they know has been traditionally Russian for so long, that they know that it was gifted to them, at one point or another. Some of these areas were gifted to them over 100 years ago, some of them over 60 years ago, some of them like hundreds of years ago. Um, but like part of the reason, of course, is most of the great resource wealth in Ukraine is in the Donbass and Zaporozhye,
And
right?
industrialization as well, on top of natural resources.
Right, right. But it's even untapped resources, and they are there, including gas and oil, right? The Ukrainians don't want to lose this because, people talk about Odessa. Like, what if the Ukrainians kept Odessa? Yeah, that could be good. And, the Ukrainians have lithium deposits on the west side of the Dnieper, right? But the east side also has it. And it would be like, how can I put it? What kind of economy could Ukraine have even if it had Odessa? Obviously, if they didn't have Odessa and they lost the east, it would be very bad, right? Obviously, having Odessa is still better than not having Odessa.
I think you're
But I guess
discounting one of Ukraine's biggest economic potentialities.
yes,
If
yes,
if you
right.
if you keep Odessa, you know what the Ukrainians can do with Odessa?
What?
They have direct access to sell their own people on the Turkish slave markets,
Oh my God.
which is Zelensky's next move, I guarantee it.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's it. Look, they don't want those men back for conscription purposes. That's the front. That's the justification. But I digress. As you were saying,
I mean, what do you think? I think the slow approach so far, like I'm just saying, there have been problems with Putin's indecision, his lack of decisiveness at times, right? Um, but I think it can't be argued that this slow approach still seems to be working.
well, I think another thing you have to point about the slow approach is that there is a big elephant in the room that few people touch when they talk about Russia's approach in Ukraine on the battlefield, and that is the opinion of the so-called neutral countries, the unaligned countries, even as up to the BRICS countries. How much, in terms of public image, would India and China tolerate of Russian aggression, for lack of a better word, in Ukraine? If Russia conducted, let's just say, even 1/5 of what Israel did in Gaza in Ukraine, how much support would
Oh
they
yeah,
have
yeah,
from,
yes,
say,
yes,
India, China, places in Africa, Latin America, other parts of East Asia as well? Like I said, the parts of the world that are not aligned with the West, the global South, as some may call them, for some parts of those. And I think India is the big crux there because India, right there, is straddling the line between East and West. Still has relatively good relations with the United States and many Western countries, but also very good relations with the Russians. How much would they be able to put up with before, just for the sake of public image, they would be forced to disassociate themselves with the Russians? And I think that's been a major consideration in terms of the approach to the war, that it has to be conducted maybe cleanly as possible isn't the right word for it, but they have to be very careful about what they do. They can't just level entire blocks of cities in western Ukraine, for example, like what Israel has done in Gaza. And they have to have some tact to this conflict. Not only for that, also for
Hmm.
internal public opinion in Ukraine, because as we've discussed many times before, there's a large swath of the population in Ukraine that could really go either way. That could, depending on the direction of the conflict, see themselves more as aligned with the Kiev government or more in line with the Russian nation. And I do think that the initial shock of the SMO probably did drive a lot of those people to the Kiev government. Now, 2 years on in the conflict, with the incompetence shown by Kiev, with some of the efforts put into the annexed territories by Russia, such as the reconstruction of particularly Mariupol, as well as other cities within the annexed territories, that may have softened their opinion or made their opinion more neutral. But also, you had instances where a lot of the people in the East who welcomed the Russians felt spurned by the fact that they withdrew in 2022 from several areas, leaving them behind to face the repercussions of the Ukrainian army.
Yeah, yeah.
So, like I said, there's that the swing vote of Ukraine, I guess we can call them,
Yes,
who
that's a great way of putting it.
have to be could have had to be convinced or cajoled into the Russian side because these people very well could be part of the Russian nation just the same as anyone within core Russian territory, but could also very well, depending on the behavior of the Moscow government, depending on the behavior of Russian forces in the field, could very well see their future with Kiev or, in more extreme cases, even with the West. So there's a lot of that to take into consideration with this as well, in terms of also international reputation. And also, let's not ignore the potential NATO response, especially early on. If it had been the full bore offensive that a lot of people would hope for, if it had been the total war a lot of people would hope for, I'm not saying it would have gotten outright intervention right away, but they risked the very real possibility of NATO troops in significant numbers entering into Ukraine, not necessarily even on the battlefield, but say in Kiev, in Odessa, in Lvov, in major cities in the central and west. They risked a limited NATO intervention. They also risked them maybe being a little bit more generous with the aid they give, maybe being a little bit more generous with so-called expeditionary forces. Perhaps Ukraine would have gotten F-16 sooner on a timeline when they could have actually been trained to use them and see their effectiveness in combat and not have their own air defense system shoot them down. Like I said, so there was a lot of considerations, and sure, you can levy a lot of criticism at Putin for a number of things, and even including the SMO, including some of the conduct in the war, and maybe it was too soft. But I think what a lot of people look at is they look at the purely military aspect side, which you have to. It is a war. There is a place for that. You do have to have people who look at the nitty gritty of military strategy, while they overlook all of the political considerations. And I mean, to borrow the quote from Clausewitz, which has been repeated a million times, but still holds true. War is a continuation of politics.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's also like there is an escalation that never makes it to the news or is so implicit. You really, really have to comb through the text. For instance, we've talked about on the show many times when there is a strike, like this week, for instance. Let's say from the 26th onwards, there was a strike in Kramatorsk and another one in Kryvyi Rog, I think. And both places had mercenaries and possibly NATO trainers and commanders, right? There's the Polish guy that got taken out in Czechoslovakia. There's the British guy some months earlier that apparently died in the Pyrenees, right? So what I'm saying is if the West goes too far, then the Russians will take out some of these guys. That's the escalation that you don't see, right? That's going on as well. And I think the Americans have also war gamed this whole thing. That I do think the Biden administration is eventually going to tell the Ukrainians, yes, you can strike deep into Russia. But the problem is that a lot of these missile systems that the Ukrainians have at the moment, like a lot of them, the Russians have already figured out like how to how to overcome. You notice now, like yes, some of the oil refineries that get hit by the Ukrainians, like this is done with like FPV drones, and these industrial areas are highly flammable to begin with. So it doesn't take a lot to cause something really spectacular. But there hasn't been another attack on the Kerch Bridge that has been successful. Um, there was an attack on a ferry that was destroyed by the Ukrainians. In the last 2 weeks or so. But even like FPV drones, one of the let me see if I can find it. But this is in what I'm about to get into was covered in the recent video by History Legend. For instance, in 2023, FPV drones had a 40% success rate by the Ukrainians against the Russians. So it's a very decent success rate. It's almost, one out of every two. FPV drone attacks in 2024 have dropped down to 10%. So what I'm saying is if you extrapolate that in terms of, electronic warfare to curtail the effects of missile systems and FPV drones, it could be that the Americans are kind of hesitant about, um, giving them the permission to do this, but it's not that successful. The other thing is um, they might be worried about where the Russians will retaliate and how they'll retaliate. Yes, in terms of sort of the news simulation that people go through, it's going to look like they haven't done anything because that's not going to be covered by the Western press. But the Russians probably will, like I say, they will take out mercenaries. I mean, remember the foaming at the mouth that Macron went through 2-3 months ago after the Russians took out all those mercenaries of the French, both in Odessa and in the Kramatorsk and Kupiansk areas, right? So, you know, uh, like I
And
would
yet
say
you still
that's
had
that's
French
at play too.
mercenaries in the Kursk operation.
What's that?
You still also had French mercenaries reporting the Kursk operation as well. So
Yes, 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 yes,
even despite all that, French clandestine aid, especially in the form of manpower, has not ended.
yes, yes. I think the Russians are fully aware that like the possibility of a trickle of of Western forces is going to be necessary, right? Because I mean everything is probably on the line right now for the Europeans.
Well, something also interesting in terms of foreign mercenaries. Ever since the situation in Georgia, perhaps I've just been overlooking it, I have noticed a decrease in the number of reported Georgian mercenaries either captured, killed, or even spotted in Ukraine.
Mm,
But I don't know if there's been any program within the Georgian government to crack down on their citizens going to fight in Ukraine. I imagine there's still back channels that can get them over there. But I have noticed a significant decrease in the past few months, at least in terms of the reports I followed, of Georgians in Ukraine.
yeah, yeah. I mean, as far as mercenaries getting killed, there was a New Zealander and an Englishman and an American that were killed in this past week or so. Um, Lots of Colombians. In fact, two Colombians who were heading back home went through Venezuela and were arrested. Like I don't know what to say. Like you have so much audacity that you think like Venezuela wouldn't arrest you. Like,
And also the Colombian units that have gotten into clashes with Ukrainians over more or less sending them into the meat grinder, sending them to
yeah,
do the missions that you are not going to survive.
yeah.
So you have seen this uptick in terms of that with foreign mercenaries as well. But I suppose with all that being said, we can move on to the strikes on
Hmm.
just all across Ukraine. So I'll put up a map just for context of where there were strikes reported. So just some context on my end personally. I was up late and up early Sunday night to Monday morning. I went to bed about 4 o'clock and woke up about 7. It was just one of those kind of nights. Now, fortunately, I didn't have to work Monday, so it wasn't that bad, all things considered. But I got to watch this happen in real time. So I saw some initial reports around 1:30 a.m., 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time, which is about plus 7 hours ahead for Ukraine time. Was about 8, 9 o'clock in Ukraine, and I saw some preliminary reports of strikes. I get up around 7:30, which once again we're talking about 2 p.m., 2:30 in Ukraine, and I'm just bored. I'm looking through Telegram, and I just see constant updates from all the usual channels of reports of
Yeah.
strikes, and that's actually where I got one of these maps from. And just to briefly summarize, within the hour, there were strikes on Kiev, Zhilnani Airport, Zaporozhye, Zhytomyr, Kharkov, Poltava, Mirgorod, Vinnytsia, Burstina, Dnipropetrovsk, Kryvyi Rog, Kremenchug, Lutsk, Kirovograd, Ternopol, Khmelnytsky, Styria, Chernigov, Nikolaev, Odessa, and Rovne. And you can see this on the map right here. If you can read Cyrillic, you can see where everything is right here. Once again, all across Ukraine, you see quite a few strikes in the west, especially towards Lutsk, which is in the northwestern corner right here, where it would border Poland. Lvov, probably most of you know where that is. Vinnytsia, which is right next to Khmelnytsky, which is like central west of the country. Uh, Obviously, Odessa saw a number of strikes, and also you see in Zaporozhye where the lines are striped on the map because that is Russian territory according to the Russian Federation. According to the referendums, they were annexed, but that is territory that the Ukrainian force still occupied. So, as far as Russian law is concerned, as far as Russian foreign policy is concerned, that is Russian land occupied by Ukraine. So you see the strikes there, and you also see a number of strikes in Kharkov as well. Sumy, you did have strikes in, but once again, this map didn't report it. Cherkasy was spared, which I suppose there wouldn't really be much of value in Cherkasy from at least what I've followed in the war. But it was interesting watching this happen in real time, and I know that last week we did have the conversation. Uh, why haven't there been more strikes in the West? What would it take for there to be more strikes in the West? And I guess we were a little ahead of the curve on that one in terms of that conversation. But once again, these were done in broad daylight. Now, the Russians have done these missile salvos before. They've done these series of attacks, which usually last about an hour, as this one did, under the cover of night, under the cover of darkness, which is how these attacks are conventionally done. Particularly to throw off air defenses, which I know, yes, they have the radar systems, but in terms of visual identification, it does make it harder for interceptors to take these down, whether they're interceptor aircraft or whether they are air ground-to-air systems to down these missiles. But they did this in broad daylight. Most of the missiles reached their targets. There are reports that even actually some of the airfields that the F-16s were supposed to take off from were hit. Now, like I said,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
talked. I mentioned briefly that yes, the first F-16 casualty came from the Ukrainians themselves. Um, but I'm sorry, it's such a ridiculous story. And then the guy who allegedly operated the system tried to claim the Russian bounty. But
Yeah, yeah.
I'm getting off topic here. To return to what we saw in Ukraine, it was a strike that really very few people expected. Now, I'm sure the Russians had probably had this plan weeks, if not months in advance. This is a plan that they had greenlit and were just waiting to pull the trigger on. And of course, Kursk gave them the perfect excuse to. Now, Russian state officials, I think it was Peskov in particular, said this was not a retaliatory strike for Kursk. This was a completely separate operation planned altogether. And like I said, you also saw quite a few strikes in Kiev as well. Towards particularly, I think in Kiev
The
they
airport.
yeah they hit the airport. And a lot of these were targeted towards infrastructure. There were military targets, but a lot of these were infrastructure targets, particularly power stations. And you had blackouts throughout Ukraine. I can't show the video because, once again, uh, YouTube is very particular about copyright, and I'd hate for something like this to get taken down over 30 seconds. But there is the Ukrainian state broadcast, the 24-hour war coverage they have on Ukrainian state TV, and you get to watch it go out in real time from this Telegram clip that was on there as well. But there were other people filming videos all across the country with. Now, once again, it was broad daylight, so power outages during the day, not that big of a deal. I'm not saying that it's no deal at all, but I can't remember whether you mentioned it off air or whether you did mention it on air. That a
Hmm.
lot of these places in Ukraine have just these gas and diesel power generators outside. But this was probably the most sweeping strike of the war. Uh, Definitely counters the claim that Russia is running out of missiles now. This was done with missiles. It was done with drones. It was actually even done with glide bombs. So it was just strikes across Ukraine as a whole. And I do think this is the first wave of the next phase of the war, showing that, as we had discussed earlier, negotiations off the table. The Zelensky government is no longer legitimate. The Kiev government is no longer legitimate. They are occupying the office past their term, and they need to depart in order for any sort of negotiations to resume. And that, given the incursions into Kursk, given the attacks on Belgorod, and given the, I suppose, what the Russians call aggressive behavior from the Ukrainians, which once again, as much as one might value international law, it does bring up an interesting question about Ukraine's actions into Russia, whether that constitutes war, because they've taken the battle for their territory into enemy territory, which, once again, once you get into the nitty gritty of international law, which doesn't really matter, it's very arbitrary, it's never applied equally. So I'm not trying to make any allusion towards that. Some consider what Ukraine to be done is an act of war, which, if we were to just objectively follow the letter of international law, it would be an act of war. But once again, we all know the reality that we're talking about here. But with all that having been said, I do think when it comes to the Russian strategy, this is the next phase, and that these strikes will continue periodically to weather down the Ukrainian power grid and weather down Ukrainian infrastructure in the lead up to winter of 2024 into 2025, which, as we've also discussed once again, is predicted to be a harsher winter than last year. Last winter was pretty mild, except for North America. There was that one cold snap, but particularly in Europe, winter 2025 is predicted to be harsh, far harsher than it was in 2024. And many people said 2022 would be the breaking point for Europe because they would all freeze to death. Many people said 2023 would. Many people said 2024 would. But once again, we saw those. That was a relatively mild winters. Now, that did come at the cost of European industry, which I have some numbers from Germany I'll get into once we finish up with our Ukraine news. But in particular, on the situation in the ground with Ukraine, I could see probably one of these strikes, say once a month until winter really kicks in, if I'm getting a proper read on the Russian strategy. Perhaps it's a one-off, but I do think if we're going to really see a new phase of the war, if we're really going to see some sort of massive Russian advance, well, maybe not massive, but some sort of significant Russian advance to the degree that we're seeing now with the breakdown of the front line, with the breakdown of morale of Ukrainian troops, that these missile strikes are going to increase as the energy issue becomes more contentious between Ukraine and the European Union, as support for Ukraine comes into question. I mean, you also have the question of the U.S. election coming up as well, where Trump, at least on his face, is wants a negotiated solution for Ukraine. And
Mm.
despite the, I know, but despite the rhetoric from Kamala and the Democrats and the continuation of the Biden White House, Ukraine has become a much lower priority from the other crises at hand. It seems like a lot of the attention is focusing to East Asia, which, strangely enough, you do see Trump actually focusing more on Europe, which I haven't had a chance to go over. I might go over it. One of the articles co-authored by Mike Pompeo, more or less laying out that Trump's Ukraine plan is offering a boilerplate peace, and if one or both sides reject, they're just going to shift the burden of supplying Ukraine onto Europe, which would be indirectly paid for by the United States. Which, just in gross summary, that is Trump's plan for Ukraine. That is Trump's policy towards Ukraine. But
Yeah.
that's aside the point. I do think in a later episode does warrant actually reading that article and getting more into detail about that. But because I brought it up, I'll just mention that as well. But what we saw on Monday, I do not think will be a one-off, because we've seen these kind of strikes before, and they've only increased in intensity, and this is the most recent wave of them. And Ukraine is at that very fragile point where these kind of actions, especially if substantial damage is done, especially if repairs and protection is not done in time, this could destabilize the entire country even further than it already has been. And this is not a country that can take much more pressure. We've seen the dysfunction of the Ukrainian state apparatus day by day. I know if you're on Telegram,
Yeah.
which don't worry, we'll mention Durov, we'll get into his case, and some of the weird stuff about his brother actually still lives in St. Petersburg, because I do think
Yeah, he does.
yeah,
He looks nothing like him.
it very, very interesting when that happens. I suppose that that old saying about when a Slav is born, a coin is flipped. But I'm sure you've all heard that on the show
Wow.
before. But you can see it in Lukashenko's sons too.
Yes, yes, yes,
Very
yes.
much so. The two Slavic phenotypes. But I'm getting sidetracked here. My apologies. But if we are if you continue to watch what happens in Ukraine on the ground in Telegram, which, like I said, you can get pro-Russian sources, you can get pro-Ukraine sources, you can get objective observer sources on Telegram. That's the great thing about it. The day-to-day operations of Ukrainian society, the day-to-day functions of the Ukrainian state, degrade with each passing day, with each passing week, and it cannot tolerate this kind of massive force applied to it on top of the ongoing war effort. I mean, we're talking about a country that has just barely staved off a default in this time. But I will notice something interesting, because you did see on this map. Perhaps it's nothing of strategic value, but interestingly, you do notice that Zakarpattia and Uzhgorod, which is the main city in Zakarpattia, was spared from the strikes. And mind you, that's where
Mm.
a large amount of the Hungarian diaspora in Ukraine are. That has been a sticking point of Orban's government against Ukraine. So whether that's just because of lack of strategic targets, or whether that's I don't know, maybe trying to throw a bone to potential pressures that could come from a European country on Ukraine, who knows? Maybe it's a little both. And also the same thing with uh, Chernovici, which is an area with a lot of the Romanian diaspora who have been suffering much the same persecution as the Hungarian diaspora as well. And Romania has been less vocal about that. Of course, their government is much more in line with the NATO narrative, but there has been some pushback from the Romanian government, to their credit. Let's not go too far, but there's been some pushback. But you'll notice actually,
What is it? What does Emil say? Something about if the pigs are quiet.
they're up to something. Yeah, something.
They're up to something. He likens the Romanians as pig, even though he's Romanian. If the pigs are quiet, they're up to something. Oh my God.
I mean, who knows what this next phase of the war will deliver? Yes, I will have to show the difference between the Durov brothers when we get to that segment right here.
It's just unbelievable.
I just saw what you sent me. But to wrap up, just the Ukraine news in general, expect more of these strikes. If I had to take my best guess here, expect more of these strikes, because now is the time where for I think the best term we could put to it is for the decapitation strikes to happen in terms of the Ukrainian state.
Well, you know what? I think shortly before you and actually, I think you explained the situation very well, and I think your prediction is right, that they are going to increase more of these attacks. Right? You could look at this, this situation in Ukraine through like a different lens. Like you could look at what Russia is doing is like a slow, like a slow disintegration of Ukrainian infrastructure. It happens so slowly, but the effects eventually become, overwhelming. They obviously now they can't repair the kind of damage that the Russians are doing quickly enough, right? So that's one stage that they're at, that the Russians can make worse. That becomes like a bargaining tool, right? Now, you could look at the whole Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians, kind of as a as a way to, I don't know, stop that from happening, like to move resources in a different direction. But it's really not working out, right? And the Times of London had an article today that like described two different platoon commanders. One who lost 5 men, three injured, two dead. The other one, his platoon, only 5 of his 20 survived. The rest were killed. And so they're like explicitly saying that it. I think Forbes or Bloomberg also had an article this week outlining that if this was a diversionary tactic by the Ukrainians, it's failed. And in different words, that's what I think the Times of London is implying as well. Um, so yeah, I think what you're outlining, that it's going to increase, it's going to bring more pressure on the Ukrainians. Like you wouldn't do what they're do like you wouldn't do what they're doing, right? Um, unless they were desperate, right? Um, they've always needed, like I said in the last show, they've always needed like some kind of a plan that has this weird. It's literally like we're gonna fly towards a Death Star. I hate to use this kind of imagery because I don't care about any of that shit at all. Like I'm a Gen Xer, so and I'm one of those Gen Xers that doesn't collect toys for movies. But
And you call
let's just
yourself a
say
Westerner.
so so I guess it's always been like I'm going to shoot into this hole in the Death Star, and then it'll blow it all up, and that's how we win, right? Everything's a Hail Mary. Everything is a Hail Mary, right?
But
And the
little did
reason
they
they
know,
say, I
reality
think
is
another
not
reason they say,
directed by George Lucas.
yeah.
But do
And the reason
continue,
they say
please.
there's no that the Russians have no red lines, as I said earlier, the Russians are crossing red lines that the West would rather not talk about. But and then this doesn't mean, as I outlined earlier, I could also talk about how they'll just give better weapon systems to Iran and the Houthis and so on and so on. But um, what I mean is the Ukrainians are looking for this kind of one weird trick that solves their dilemma. And they have to say that the Russians have no red lines because they are so desperate not to lose. They would do something insane. Like they would blow up a nuclear power plant. I think that's how serious the situation is for them. I think they know that. And I think this winter is going to be extremely hard for them, you know? So, but I think there were some other things around Ukraine, but I've kind of forgotten about them.
Let me see. Let me just take a brief look over my notes just to see if there's anything about Ukraine that I wanted to cover. Oh, so the U.S. aid packages are down to a pathetic 125 million, and this was
Yeah.
announced on Friday by the Associated Press, which will include HIMARS, Javelin anti-tank systems. We're back to the Javelins, electronic warfare systems, as well as 105 and 155 millimeter shells and other equipment. But the other big news out of Ukraine, if you want to call it that, is that Modi visited and was accosted by Zelensky for not kissing the ring enough. But Modi also paired that with a visit to Poland, where he met with Duda and Tusk. Now, Duda and Tusk did not get to hug. Unfortunately, they cannot claim the same privileges as Zelensky. But in all seriousness, the meeting between Zelensky and Modi was it reached an impasse relatively quickly, where Zelensky demanded India put more pressure on Russia. India said we want a solution to the conflict and we want to help broker negotiations. And of course, there were the official statements that India, of course, is willing to be a neutral partner in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky kvetched about it for some reason, and we were back to square one. And then Modi went to Poland, and Duda and Tusk decided, hey, maybe we need more temporary workers, which It is a gross simplification of how the meeting went with the Polish officials, but it more or less came down to legal immigration agreements and Modi pushing for that, like he does in many Western countries, as we know, as we've seen, as he did at a Trump rally, for all things, and had Trump do it at a rally in India as well. But that's not really to the point of what I'm trying to get here. But you have, at this point, you've had Kuleba visit China, where they reached the same impasse. You have had Modi visit Ukraine, where the same impasse is
Sullivan was
reached.
in China as well.
Yes, I will get to that. Actually, later in the show, I do have some notes on that. I'll get to later. Which that was a pathetic visit, to say the least. There was not a good showing for Sullivan, and really going back to the Biden administration's entire approach to China from the first summit that they had in Alaska with that purple-haired woman, it it was over before it even began. I'll just put it that way.
Mm.
But in terms of the BRICS countries and the relations to Ukraine, now mind you, China, India, as well as I know Brazil hasn't really been involved in this conflict either from Bolsonaro or from Lula's government. That neither of them really went against Russia, but they also have kept their hands off the conflict because I mean, it is on the other side of the world for them. Brazil is not a global power. They're not an insignificant country by any means, but they don't have that kind of global weight to throw around. But when it comes to the BRICS countries, past 20 years, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, India has a lot of investments in Ukraine. China, especially, has a lot of investments in Ukraine. And while they are admittedly more pro-Russia, at least in terms of policy, at least in terms of behavior, they're officially neutral. And also, they need to make sure that their investments, the money that they put in this country, whether in terms of land resources, industry, the economy, that there is some sort of payout, that there is some sort of at the very least, they break even on their investments and they don't lose out as a result of the Russian war effort. Now, clearly, there isn't enough for China to pressure Russia to, say, ease up on Ukraine. But like I said, Ukraine has been a country for the past 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union that has been a magnet for international finance, and not in the good way either. It has been a magnet for a lot of underhanded dealings and also a lot of what some might call exploitative dealings. When it comes to the kind of economic investment they were attracting, which they were attracting a lot, it, let's just say, whether through the fault of the countries investing, whether the fault of the various governments in Kiev, the money that they received from those investments was not spent properly on the country. But that's a topic for a different day. But getting back to my ultimate point, there are a lot of these countries on the ostensibly neutral side that have not gone against Russia and have even been tacitly supportive of Russia that still have their own interest in Ukraine tied up there long before the war that they still need to make sure they get something out of, even if it is some sort of renegotiation under Russia. And actually, we did talk about this. Maybe it was an episode that you weren't on, but I went over in brief one of the meetings uh, between the U.S. and Russian officials in Turkey, with a Turkish delegation there as well, and also representing business interests from both sides, where some of the backdoor negotiations were making sure that in a scenario where Ukraine most likely does have to concede some land to Russia, how will that affect these companies that have invested in land holdings in Ukraine? How will it affect these countries who have invested in resources in Ukraine? Is there going to be any sort of easing of sanctions on Russia? How is that going to work? How much investment we're going to be able to work with the Russians? What are the Russians going to do with our assets in Ukraine? So there were actually a lot of business interests that were discussed in that conversation. And I can imagine, especially when it comes to India and China, both very large economies, both rising economies for that matter, they also have those concerns as well. But clearly, when it comes to that, they aren't going to, like I said, they're not going to put their daggers up to Russia's throat over it. But there are some guarantees they most likely do want from the Russian side and from the Ukrainian side.
Yeah.
But in terms
So
of Modi's visit, that's really all you could say. It wasn't very eventful beyond the fact that it was just Zelensky behaving like he always does in a very demanding way up against a country that isn't completely supportive of Ukraine, which led to an impasse very quickly. This wasn't like a meeting with a Western leader where It's Zelensky makes demand, and there's applause and handshakes and hugs. Now there was the hug, but once compare it to other Zelensky hugs, I'm sure you'll notice the difference. I hate to become a body language analysis, but I'm sure you'll notice the difference in short order. But that is all I had for just the side news in Ukraine, unless you had any other items I had left out.
No, no, I think that that covers about everything. I mean, I always regret it because there's always one or two things, but honestly, we we need to carry on with the show. But I think we covered the vast majority of the, of the issues and such.
So I suppose our next logical move would be to move on to the arrest of Pavel Durov,
Yeah.
founder of Telegram, co-founder of Telegram, I should say. And let me just get the image you sent to me because on so these are the Durov brothers, and as we were saying, when a Slav is born, a coin is flipped. Now, it would only complete the image if Pavel, who we have on the left, was a blonde. And like I said, that's the only missing factor from this. But on the other side, you have his brother Nikolai, who lives in St. Petersburg. Now, Pavel Durov, I believe he left Russia in 2012. It was around the time of once Putin returned to power, and there was some upset against him from actually across the political spectrum in 2012. But his brother did stay, and mind you, his brother was the he was the numbers guy. He was the coding guy behind a lot of this. Now Durov, Pavel Durov, I should say, because they're both Durov, dealt more with like the business and one could even say the public relations side, but in terms of say the financial side of the business and actually more the role of what you expect from a CEO rather than somebody who is working the nitty gritty of the company. And he is a I believe, tri-citizen because he's a Russian citizen. He is an Emirati citizen, which Telegram is still headquartered out of Dubai in the United Arab
Yeah.
Emirates, and he's also a French citizen. And he was detained on his private jet landing in France from Azerbaijan, where the speculation came that he was in the same time when Putin was having his diplomatic meeting with the Azeris and with others there as well, that there was either officials in the Russian government or Russian business interests who were approaching Durov or Durov was approaching them. Once again, that's all speculation. And then from Azerbaijan, he landed in France, where he was promptly arrested under the charges of the crimes that people use to commit Telegram. The I phrased that backwards.
Literally every
Yes,
single.
every single crime that has been plotted or committed with Telegram, from the most minor to the most severe, can be pinned on Durov, despite the fact that number one, Telegram uh, does concede to cooperating with whatever local laws. I'm sure you've all been on Telegram. It's like uh, this channel cannot be displayed because it violates local laws. I'm sure you've all run into that at some point,
Yeah.
frustratingly so. But I digress. So they cooperate with whatever is from the EU, whether it's from the United States, UK, Russian government. Like I said, they don't outright censor anything to that degree, but they will regionally block things, and they will kowtow to that. But apparently, the French government wanted Durov to give up the encryption key, which once again, I feel like the big part of this being left on the conversation is the fact that when it comes to the encryption, when it comes to a lot of the technical side of that, that's all his brother, who is currently in Russia as a Russian citizen, as far as we know, untouched by the government, living a completely normal life of a successful businessman, at least in the capacity that he is. But Dorov, the world traveler, the guy who goes on Tucker Carlson, the real face of Telegram, arrested in France. And every time I see the charges, it's always dubious. It's always shifting. The fact that he's been detained has not changed, and that he's going to face some sort of legal action in France uh, seems to be the case. Now, he has requested consular services from the Emiratis, and because the UAE, once again, we're talking this major tax haven, it is one of those countries that has played a neutral side in this war. Now, being a Gulf state, it of course has heavy Western influence in it, but it's not completely beholden to Western influence. I mean, it is one of the few Arab states, even for a Gulf state, that does recognize Israel. So uh, that is a red flag in and of itself. But once again, this is a country that has played its role well. It's tax haven, so it kind of has to play all sides of any international conflict. And there was actually an interesting report that came out. Now, the Emiratis, of course, didn't confirm whether this was in response, but they actually suspended the purchase of fighter jets from France after the arrest of Durov. And France and the UAE, when it comes to military cooperation, France is the main military supplier of the UAE and has been for past number of years. And I think they also do host a small number of French forces in the Emirates, but they may have withdrawn at this point. But I know within recent history they did. So there is a decent relations between the two countries. But what many have speculated, and I did originally hear this from the Duran, that part of the reason for the arrest of Durov and the cracking down on
Mm-hmm.
Telegram, or the attempt to crack down on Telegram, isn't necessarily to shut it down in the West, which I'm sure they would love to, but I don't think that's the primary goal. But it is to have more leverage over a media platform, a social media platform that hosts a massive number of Russians. Pretty much, it is the messaging app in Russia, and that's what they use for that. And we're talking anywhere from like official government accounts, businesses, other organizations within Russia, down to individuals. And for those of you who live outside the United States and Canada, which I didn't know until I actually traveled outside the country, apparently sending SMS messages, the traditional text messages, is very expensive. So, in other parts of the world, whether that even be in Europe, in Russia, and East Asia, they all use different messaging app. Whether that's WhatsApp, whether that's there's some of the other ones out there I can't remember. But Telegram is the big one in Russia and the former Soviet Union, even in Ukraine. And Dorov is also no stranger to the Russian tech world. He created VK, which is the uh, major Russian social media site that functions as um, at least until the more globalized internet, functioned as their version of, say, Facebook, YouTube, with a number of other things as well. I've actually played around with VK. It's a fun website, admittedly. There actually is a very small pocket of Anglophone VK, which I do recommend if you're ever bored. It's a well of schizophrenia, the good kind, mind you, but that's aside the point. So he cut his teeth on that. Then once again, he was really known for Telegram, and now you have the West cracking down on Telegram because it is relatively unimpeded information. Now, like I said, that does come with some drawbacks. That does come with a relatively unmoderated platform, which does lead to some more shadier dealings on there. But I think, you know, you and I use it plenty. Most of our audience probably uses it. Pretty much anyone who is a normal person who has no ill intent is not going to encounter any of that kind of stuff. The worst you'll encounter is crypto scammers, which there's a lot of, but they're very easy to ignore. But they want to pin this on him once again for obvious reasons. And like I said, we're not even talking about somebody who was, uh, you know, uh, an agent, a creature of the Russian regime, somebody who has been very publicly at odds with Putin and the Russian government in the past. But I do think, once again, not an original point of mine, something many people have made, is that it has shattered the illusion of a lot of, say, the more upwardly mobile and possibly liberal, sympathetic, Western sympathetic class in Russia that even our dissidents are now persecuted by the West, that there's simply no room for any sort of recourse in the West, that they view us all the same, liberal, right wing, whatever. The West makes no distinction.
Right.
We're all unless we want to call for the downfall of the Russian government, unless we go as far as Navalny, we're all the same to them.
Right. There's that part of it, now the one of the things that I found intriguing and still didn't understand after that Durand episode was, so back in 2016, the Russian government asked that he give 6 months of government access to Russian citizens who subscribed to Telegram, and he felt that that was, a breach of, like, it was a free speech, breach of free speech. Right now, we all know that Google, Meta, all of these social media platforms have already been infiltrated. The government denied it, but then, it comes out, especially around the time of COVID, and as COVID was ending, we know that many security breaches, they went in anyways. Okay. Anyhow, Dudov apparently said no. But then I heard that he said yes back in like 2018, right? Now, he did a lot of pranks. He trolled Putin, like Putin wanted the keys to Telegram, so he sent them these old-fashioned keys, which obviously, it was a joke. Back then, he was a darling of the West. Um, not so much now. And I think part of the reason, of course, they want to shut this down, besides that it has its own cryptocurrency, and it's the ninth biggest cryptocurrency in the world, right? And some have argued that the Russian government was fearful that it was more fearful of the cryptocurrency than it was, um, um, what kind of messages were being sent on Telegram. Okay. So, but then on the other hand, they like I don't know what they did in order to stem the Telegram cryptocurrency, which is called Ton. Um, Western powers are also afraid of this, obviously, right? They've managed to hem in the other cryptocurrencies, but this one is I guess rogue. There was also the case not too long ago where Israeli documents were leaked or hacked, and they were published on Telegram. Telegram is kind of like it's a wild place. I mean, I I would say that there is less censorship on Telegram. There is censorship on Telegram. Remember, like you can't get RT on Telegram. You need like a good VPN. I have a VPN. I still can't get it.
Oh yeah.
Um,
No, I just have one of the bog standard ones, but I tried to go on RT. No, I can't find it. And once again, those of you who have used Telegram, even the one you've downloaded directly from the website, will always get the "you can't access the channel, it violates local laws" nonsense that they get all the time.
yeah,
And try using Telegram in Europe and within the European Union. That's fun. But I digress.
yeah. I mean, obviously, there's many reasons why they want to shut them down, right? Like, part of it is the cryptocurrency. Part of it is because it has gained so much popularity, and of course, it is the social media platform for the war in Ukraine. There's no question about that, right? It overtook Twitter. People rely on it, even if they rely on it just for messaging, and the platform that this given group will be YouTube or Twitter Space or whatever. It's a good messaging platform. Now, it's not even like Telegram isn't even very well encrypted anyways. Like it's from what I understand, I don't have expertise in this, but from what I have read in certain articles, you know, um, there's other social media platforms that are harder to crack than Telegram, right? So yeah, you have breaches. I mean, he has lots of enemies. Israel is obviously an enemy. America's an enemy. The West is an enemy. They all want him, and of course, one of the ways it's suspected that he got duped, of course, is he had, as he said, French citizenship, and he has this bimbo like in, I think she's Russian in the United Arab Emirates. They have kids. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if they're his kids. He's also like a sperm donor. Like he has 100 children. It's
He's
it's
also
just
not committed
ridiculous,
to
right?
one woman, so this was probably just a lady for the night, not a lady of the night. There's a difference, not much, but there is a difference.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I saw some
But
outlandish
she's been with
claims.
him longer,
Yes,
I think. As far as I
I think
understand.
this is one of his
And
preferred ones, if you want to put it that way.
yes, yes, and she took. Of course, she's a complete narcissist, so she takes photos of herself wherever she is, whatever she's doing. There's never enough attention.
and she's
Gentlemen,
publishing them. So,
I just want to leave you one word because you brought that up. Something I have noticed, something I'm sure you have noticed, and something you probably all noticed, but bears repeating. Women do not understand OPSEC, and that is probably the most important thing you can learn about dealing with them.
good point. Yeah, so I guess we'll find out. I guess we'll find out what. I mean, I think there's a very good possibility. He could be traded. This could be just a ploy, basically, to get the Russians to free some prisoner still in Russia in order for Durov. But would Durov go for it? You know, it depends. I think the Russians want Durov to capitulate.
Can the Emiratis smuggle him out?
Oh yeah, the Emiratis.
He's
It's a,
got connections.
it's a jihad to free Durov.
Or maybe they'll exchange him for the more important Durov.
Mm,
The one who
that's right.
actually knows how the app works, the one who actually knows how the service works.
I mean, what if these brothers don't get along? Like,
Yeah,
yeah, he's just what? He's just the PR man. I'm the brains. I created all of this, not him.
I have the keys.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll show the picture once again because I think people are overlooking this. Like, which of these men do you think actually made Telegram? I'll ask you that. I'll ask
Yeah.
you, the audience, that. But,
I mean,
yeah.
it's just another example of the West demanding 100% capitulation, right? You can like, there's just no room. It's kind of like the way they deal with Hungary. Like, for instance, Burrell, like there was supposed to be a meeting of the EU to take place in Hungary. Hungary's in charge of the EU, I think, for the next 6 months or so. These things are on rotation. And it was for, allowing deep strikes into like a multilateral meeting where all the EU countries agree that um, Ukraine can fire deep within Russia. Okay. And Burrell called it off because, you know, Hungary isn't, it hasn't 100% capitulated. And the 100% capitulation would be like some stupid Western type stooge and Orban out of office and, a total. A total NPC basically for the regime. And so that meeting is going to convene, I believe, in Brussels
They want
appropriately.
Hungary to be
So,
run like
so it's the
Romania,
same thing
is
with
the best way I
Dudov.
can put
Like
it.
he imagines he's a liberal guy. I'm not sure. Some people have said that he's Jewish or part Jewish. It's hard to say. His brother to me does not look Jewish. I think he looks a bit Jewish, but how much I don't know.
Too much time in the sun will do that to you, but
Like I don't, yeah, I don't know. Like would he have been like if he was Jewish? Would he have like looked the other way as much as he did with the breach of the Israeli security that took place? So I don't know. I don't know. But I think there's a very real possibility the West will try to offer him up to Russia. If he's locked, I mean, the West is capable, of course, of locking him up for 10 to 20 years. I don't doubt that, right? But they would rather have Telegram. I mean, Macron asked for Telegram. They asked Telegram relocate to France and make it a French company, and Tudov said no. I believe this was in 2016,
2018.
2018, sorry. So,
I mean, it's too new of a story to really speculate that much on. But I think the idea of using him as a bargaining chip, looking for another prisoner exchange, is probably the best they can do. And the question is, to what length is Russia going to go to bail him out? I don't think that they are going to completely spurn him, or I don't know. Maybe I'm sorry to keep mentioning them, but maybe the other angle is maybe he's a bargaining chip for the Emiratis. maybe they
Yeah, yeah,
maybe they have some hardball negotiations in the Gulf, and he's there. But like I said, I think the idea that they want to exchange him for somebody the Russians may be holding is probably the best. And I also had to wonder the circumstances of why he landed in France, of all places, because I think what somebody was going into, and of course I love to get in the plane autism. He was flying on an Embraer jet, which I don't remember the exact model. Uh, Brazilian jet company. They are the third largest after Boeing and Airbus. So it's a distant third. Don't get me wrong, but they have a presence in the international market. And I think this particular model of jet taking off from Azerbaijan with its fuel capacity could have made it to Iceland. And I believe he was en route to New
hmm
York, if I have my facts straight with that. Where the Icelandic government most likely would not have taken any sort of action against him like that. But he landed in France, and I don't know, maybe his pilot was paid off, and it was a sabotage op. Maybe somebody from Washington made the call because, look, the French might have more independence than say Germany, but we all know that France, I would say, post de Gaulle, is a very subdued country. Uh,
yeah. By the way, the shares for Ton, the cryptocurrency, they did fall the day that this happened by 8%. I don't know where it is now. I mean, that's kind of normal to be honest. I don't know if they've picked up again. I don't know if they've reached where they were, but there was a dip.
that
It's just
was
that I think the bottom line is it's just a platform that like a lot of Russians use, and they use it for the Ukraine war, and the West does not want the Western population using it because it undermines their narrative, right? Like media and governments are all about narrative,
I mean, even
right?
if you follow resident and deep state, it undermines the Ukrainian war narrative. So,
Yeah,
yeah, there's because it is straight from the horse's mouth. You do actually get to see footage from the war in real time. You get updates in real time, and it does come down to narrative. They don't like that they can't manage that narrative. They don't like that it causes skepticism among people in the West. And let's be honest,
yep,
the people in the West using Telegram are, uh, for lack of a better term, political dissidents. Now, they might not be outright persecuted
yes,
by the state, but they are people on the political fringes of Western society. Whether that be on the more right wing side, as I would say, ostensibly we and our audience are, or even like I've stumbled in them before. They're not fun places. I don't like to stay in them long. But there's even more, I guess you'd say, dissident left Telegram channels as well. And it's not like Facebook, definitely. It's not even like Twitter, and I suppose Musk is 1 foot in, 1 foot out when it comes to allowing dissident thought on the platform. But more or less, it allows these people to coalesce. It allows them, even if they aren't taking any sort of political action, it lets them discuss their ideas, which is even beyond the pale for them. So I do think that's another angle where they can shut down the alternative communication within the West, and they don't even have the luxury of it being a Russian company where they can just pull the switch on it because, like I said, it's based out of the UAE.
yeah.
But that's all I had for the issue with Telegram, and I suppose we're kind of up on the 2 hour mark, so we can move a little bit faster through some of the other news I have here, because there's nothing in particular I want to dwell on. I suppose there is a little bit of news out of the Middle East, which we'll get into, but I think the other big story of the night that I definitely want to make sure to cover is Serbia, with the
Yes.
with the continuation of the, I guess you could say, half-baked color revolution going on, and some of the moves by both the U.S. and France to gain influence in Serbia. So the first piece of news I saw regarding this is that CIA Director William Burns was visiting with Serbian officials, actually with Serbian intelligence officials as well as Vucic, in light of these protests over the lithium deposits and a potential exploitation of the lithium deposits. Now, to my understanding, it was just a very boilerplate meeting. Burns in this administration has taken on the role of something of a second Secretary of State because Blinken has to take on so many of Biden's responsibilities for obvious reasons. So he gets dispatched. I mean, and also, in my opinion at least, Burns commands a little bit more respect than, say, Blinken or Sullivan, so they will send him over for, let's just say, more hardline operations. I mean, I think that you've even had him visit China a few times, for that matter. So they sent him over there, and he was talking with the Serbian government. And then the next big story is that the Serbs are trying to secure a deal for 12 Rafael fighters, and that's on top of when it comes to the current Serbian air fleet. I think they have about 15 MiG fighters of various models left over from uh, both the communist days and from their current relations with Russia. Vucic insisted, of course, we all know how much of a snake he can be, that his cooperation with the West doesn't mean any sort of abandonment of Serbia's relationship with Russia. So he's trying to walk this fine line that Serbia, in its position, doesn't really have the leverage to walk. Now, mind you, this is a country surrounded completely by NATO states. You have Hungary to the north, which is probably the most amenable. There has been some relief coming from Hungary in terms of cooperation between their governments, but you have Croatia and Bosnia and and Montenegro to the west. You have Kosovo, North Macedonia to the south. You have Romania to the east. So, like I said, this country is completely boxed in. There's not much recourse they have in terms of taking an anti-NATO policy. Now, as we've said previously, they've held out much longer than I think anyone could have realistically expected from them, and that it does seem, at least on a grassroots level, there is some degree of resistance left to NATO, and that's in no small part thanks to the very sour taste left in their mouths from the NATO interventions in the 1990s. People that's still within living memory. People can still recall that, and they have still not gotten past that, and understandably so. Like I said, this is all living memory. It was complete destruction of their country. And Vucic, because of political reality and the fact that he's also not a very strong-willed man, has to court the West. And this purchase of Rafael fighters seems to be the next move into that. And of course, he has never reneged on the idea of European integration. To his credit, he has never pursued the idea of NATO integration. But he also has involved himself in these negotiations with Kosovo over the past 4 or 5 years. I'm sure you remember when Trump and Richard Grenell championed the so-called peace deal they got between Serbia and Kosovo, which was very, a very satisfying moment. I recall that was September 2020 when a lot of those concessions are made, and Trump wanted to say he secured this big peace deal, but that's aside the point. But even in terms of trade volume, even in terms of just diplomatic relations, they've been forced into the Western sphere, but there still is, I think, simply because of public sentiment, that small holdout that keeps them from completely pulling the trigger. And I do think as they get more funds from the West, as there's further trade and especially military cooperation in terms of sale of hardware, they are going to be gradually sucked into the West. I'm not saying entirely, things could rapidly change, but you'll notice that they're doing this primarily through France because the United States would be a non-starter for that.
Mhm.
They would not go along. They could not get away with that kind of negotiations with Washington when it comes to the buying of military hardware, when it comes to any discussion of economic relation or exploitation of natural resources. Any not that Serbian-U.S. relations are particularly bad, but in terms of public sentiment, they could not get away with that much American money and hardware in the country, and they have to launder it through their proxy, particularly in France and particularly in Germany. It seems like Macron has been selected to conduct this task as it stands. But the funny thing from this, I would say the funniest part of this, is the hand wringing coming out of Bosnia, which, mind you, has no fighter aircraft. in its country. None of its own fighter aircraft in this country. It has massive amounts of NATO fighter aircraft in the country. But yeah, they were not satisfied by this deal, and also Croatia, which has 6 Rafale jets under contract, feel that it will delay their shipments, so they were not happy about it either. So it was funny to see some of the internal squabbling, but I do think they now that tensions have escalated with Russia, now that there is the full scale war in Ukraine, and that anything to do with Russia and Europe to this day, even though it has softened from what it was in 2020, is just a non-starter politically, unless you're in Belarus or uh, I don't know, maybe Moldova, some sections of Moldova, excluding Transnistria. There still is some room for that. But anything to do with Russia has become more or less non-starter. So the West is finally pulling the trigger, and they are making their move on Serbia in order to suck them into the Western sphere. Now the question is, how are they going to do this? How successful is it going to be? In terms of EU ascension, you'll notice that the EU has actually, since Brexit, despite their rhetoric, has been very hesitant to expand. That the idea of Balkan integration has been put off several times, even from fervently pro-EU countries like Albania and like Bosnia. They have been delayed in terms of their ascension in the European Union, simply
Mhm.
because Europe cannot afford to take on more, let's just be honest, liabilities financially. In Serbia, it's a much richer country than those two. I would argue it's a much more functional country than those two. Even they, in terms of European budgets, in terms of what the EU would have to spend, would still be that liability. So right now they're just trying to settle for a client state, much like they have in Bosnia. Now I don't think they want. I don't think they're under any illusions that they can get a country as servile as Bosnia, and certainly not as servile as Albania. But they do view it as their chance, their prime opportunity, now that they have them surrounded diplomatically and even militarily, to make their final move to bring Serbia to heel. And I don't want to make any sort of predictions because I know that you've had attempts at color revolutions. I know that you had the Serbs against violence, so called, back during Vucic's election, that you've had the protests over these lithium mines. But maybe the Maidan isn't a good model to look at. There doesn't seem to be the kind of discontent to play on in order to create any sort of radical change in Serbia. Now, Vucic, regardless of how he plays, I think he's screwed. The man is not going to be in office much longer. I mean, he'll probably finish this term. He was reelected and everything, but his political career is, no matter what way you slice it over, there's not much
Yeah.
he can do to revive that. And the question of who is waiting in the wings to replace him, do they have some sort of bureaucrat shill waiting in the wings in order to take power from him and that they can rig in next election, or is there somebody who would fight a little bit more for Serbia's interest, even if it is somebody who wants to play this 1 foot in, 1 foot out game with the West, but has a little bit more of a backbone? Once again, that's the question. In terms of internal Serbian politics, I can't name any major figures aside from Vucic that would um, be a potential successor to him. But like I said, the man has proven himself that even if he were to go back on everything, all of his promises of European integration and tilt towards the West, well, that would just be game over. They would pull out every stop they had for color revolution against him. But if he were to completely bend the knee and capitulate, I still think that popular sentiment in Serbia is simply not aligned enough with the West in order to allow something like that. And maybe I read my read on that is wrong when it comes to how much discontent there is towards those kind of issues in Serbia, but I don't get the feeling from what I know about the population that they are ready to bend the knee to Western integration.
Yeah, I mean, the other issue with Serbia is, you know, in some ways, like Georgia, there is a media that is actively hostile toward him. There are even cabinet members that reflect his kind of dual policy that he's embarked on. So he has members of his own cabinet that are definitely, like I would say, left of center and aligned with some of the things about the EU. Um, like you say, Serbia doesn't have uh, that many options. It's a landlocked country. And, the protests that occurred over this proposed lithium mine, and it looks like they're going to go through with it. Uh, those protesters were not the color revolution types. Um, these people were legitimately concerned about like this enormous mine. Serbia is a small country, and that it would be devastating for the country. But again, one has to wonder, like, uh, I mean, Serbia is not doing too badly economically. Of course, it's not like, let's say, it doesn't have the wealth of a Western country.
And I mean, I
Uh,
also failed to mention, but they do have substantive economic relations with China as well.
yes, yes, they do, and they've had them for decades. So it's not nothing new. Um, yeah, so I don't know what to say. He's like, I don't want to be too easy on him either, but he's not in an easy situation. And on the other hand, you wish he could be more strong-willed, as you say, like Orban. This visit, of course, with Macron, Macron decided to elucidate everyone that he had nothing to do with Durov's arrest, even though Durov claims that it was an invitation by Macron that entrapped him. Some have argued Durov knew that this was going to happen. I don't know. Like, I mean, it's very murky, and as you said, this is very new to us. But nonetheless, Macron is in Serbia. He does want to cement this deal. He sold 8 Rafale fighter jets to Serbia. So of course, they're looking. The West, the Homo Empire, like wants to make sure that there's this one contiguous line against Russia, and behind the line there are no states that could ever be aligned with Russia, right? Like they are in a they want to make this an existential war for Russia, right? Obviously. So the subjugation of Serbia is incredibly important to them, uh, both for like moral reasons and strategic economic reasons and geopolitical reasons. They want that country completely integrated, right? And what'll happen is there'll be a generation that will be too hard to. It'll be too hard for them to look at the subjugation and the failures of the wars in the 90s. Um, in many ways, Serbia was the prototype for what America would do in the 2000s. With across the Middle East.
It is
And
interesting because if you do listen to a lot of the interviews with Douglas McGregor, Colonel Douglas McGregor, at the time of the interventions in Yugoslavia, he was still in the army. His career more or less is that he was stationed in Germany, and a lot of what he was doing was a lot of just Cold War strategy in terms of potential conflicts against the Soviet Union. But he was also in Europe post 91. And
yeah,
he was actually part of a commission within the military. I think he might have been out at that point, not really relevant on that detail, to investigate what an intervention in the Balkans would look like and what potential interests would be there for the United States, for Europe, and for Russia. And the conclusion he came to, just in raw geopolitical interest beyond this fantasy of global hegemony, that when it comes to the interest of the U.S. and NATO at the time, which of course didn't include the entirety of Eastern Europe, it being, once we're only talking 1993 or 1994, said that this is of very little interest to us, yet the Russians consider this their backyard. And if we're trying to pursue relations with the Russians, which was the official policy of the U.S. government in the 1990s,
yeah, of
this
course.
intervention would be a mistake. Of course, they took that report and they threw it out.
Yeah, because it was a lie. Kind of like the British in the lead up to World War One. Uh, be outwardly friends to Russia, but work to undermine Russia, fund communist revolutions, fund um, Muslims in Russia. Uh, get your newspapers to demonize the Tsar. Um, so on and so on and so on
Of course,
as a lead up.
London and Wall Street were very heavily invested in not only the communist revolutionaries, but just any sort of social discontent in Russia from 1905 at least onward.
Right, right. I mean, you also had countries like Germany who helped fund it and helped Lenin get back in. So I mean, the issue is it was also endemic in Russian society. You had like even swaths of the Russian royal family that were kind of sympathetic, but they were really kind of under the illusion that like the communists weren't going to prevail. Like, how can I put it? Um, Before the Bolsheviks rose to the top, there were several other groups that you could consider revolutionary, but did not officially represent a danger to the crown the way the Bolsheviks did after the successful revolution,
Because
right?
you had the assassination of Alexander II in the 1860s, 1870s.
Yeah.
It was around that time. You had the crackdowns on any sort of reforms that he had put in place by Alexander III up until Nicholas II took place upon Alexander III's untimely death. But during that time, although it was a crackdown, none of these revolutionary groups really got any traction. And the last major move that they made, now there were smaller things, but the last major move that they made was the assassination of Alexander II. Once again, we're talking in the 1860s at that point. So while there had been discontent, while there had been rumblings, it was a relatively stable situation in terms of political upheaval. It really wasn't there until 1905, which was suppressed in short order, and then once again in 1917.
Right, right. And we've discussed on the show before how I think J.P. Morgan, uh, with another prominent American, I forget his name.
Jacob
It's not a
Schiff.
name. Hmm?
Are you thinking of Jacob Schiff?
No, 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 no,
Okay,
no.
because
He wasn't Jewish, but
okay,
working with the Red Cross and smuggling rifles into Russia.
yes, that
That
was that
ultimate,
was during Wilson's administration. I do remember that.
yes, during Wilson's administration, in order to help fund the communists or help them fight. Like it was just they. I mean, the West played an enormous role in this,
And
right?
it
And
was
you get a lot of conservative Westoids who talk about communism, but they never acknowledge what their own country did to ensure that this horrible period that occurred in Russia. It's I just these people are just I don't know, they're abysmal. I have no respect for them.
and to build on that point what you said about the early roots of communism and the fact that many Western countries, if not passively allowed it, facilitated it. Particularly the British and the American expeditionary forces during the Russian Civil War, most of what they did was
Loot.
firing at white Russian forces for trying to go into the now newly independent states that were once part of the Russian Empire. Think Poland, think the Baltic states. That they were there as a check on the white forces rather than an actual
Yes.
ally.
Yes, yes. And tremendous looting, which even the Japanese did.
And of course, who could forget that the Czechoslovak Legion, which was under the French Foreign Legion, were the ones who ultimately sold out to the Tsar, to the Bolsheviks in 1918.
Yeah.
So a lot of the Western intervention, once again going back to 1918, 1919, Russian Civil War, they were there as a containment strategy on the White Russians because the Bolshevik Revolution, from its inception, was to seek the destruction of the Russian Empire and the Russians as a political bloc. And the fact
Yeah.
that the Soviet Union stabilized itself, that you later got somebody like Stalin, for all the things he did, once again stabilized the country and turned it back into a global power. That was a completely unintended consequence of anything they wanted. It was supposed to be Lenin. It was supposed to be Trotsky who tore this country apart at its seams,
Yes.
and they almost succeeded. They almost succeeded.
They
Um,
almost succeeded. Yeah. The Soviet Union actually went rogue. As bad as it went actually rogue to a great extent.
yes, and like I said, you can talk about the internal problem in the Soviet Union. The point being is, from what it was supposed to be, I would say even up until 1945, even if you want to make the example that the Soviet Union was supposed to be the meat grinder against the Germans, that's what the Western Allies had set them up for. Even if you want to make that argument, for
Yeah.
post 1945, especially post 1948, when you had the Doctor's Plot, when you had Stalin crack down on internal opposition, much of which happened to be Jewish, it was all bets off, and that's why you had the Cold War. The fact that the Soviet Union, sure, they didn't want communism at home. They were willing to publicly signal against it. They were willing to support the states surrounding the Soviet Union, but they did view the communists in power in the Soviet Union and Russia as a containment strategy. But once again, it broke containment.
Yes. Yep.
And this isn't just a historical tangent. As much as I could sit here and talk about this kind of stuff all day, while it might not be the communists, it might not be the Bolsheviks, they employ the same strategy time again, whether that be opposition groups in Russia, whether that be opposition groups in Ukraine, Serbia, wherever, the Middle East, who could forget the Arab Spring. That this is the blueprint of more or less every Western foreign policy adventure of at least the past 100 years.
I mean, yeah, I mean, even a guy like Yeltsin was not good enough. Like, ultimately, what they want is the Balkanization of Russia, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have funded the first Chechen war. And, just as an aside, this is kind of very interesting. The guys at Russians with Attitude, posted that Grozny, Chechens were a minority in Grozny around the time of let's say first half of the 20th century, right? Before Stalin moved them into Central Asia. They were a minority long before that happened. In fact, Grozny was like minority majority Russian. They were, I think, the largest group there.
I mean, the name of the city is a Russian name,
Several times
Grozny.
bigger than the Chechen group. What?
The name of the city is a Russian name, Grozny.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Grozia is grapes, but I could be wrong. Anyhow, um, so like they were never. I mean, they liked that Yeltsin let them buy everything, but even that was they weren't even satiated by that. They still wanted to balkanize the country, right? That's the entire goal of the West is the balkanization of Russia. That's all. Like ideology has nothing to do with it. They could be democratic, it could be a theocratic, it could be communist. It's not relevant. It's the fact that it's unified that irks them.
Uh, it, yes, the fact that it is a power block that they do not have, that they cannot dictate terms to, is what they do not want, and they'll support anything against that. You do see a similar phenomenon in China where, whether it is the Communist Party or whether, say, I suppose in the past, once again, China centric humiliation. Its recent history up until I would say actually the modern era has not been a good one for them. But once again, the idea of a unified power block, and you see this when the Europeans went into China, and once again, you can talk about the merits of the European empires, what they did right or wrong, but what they did do objectively is that they did play the internal politics of China, they played the internal politics of India, as one does, to break up these power blocks. And I would say on a much larger scale, they did this to the Russians, and that in terms of any sort of civilization alternative, much more than, say, a lot of these other areas that they may have intervened in over the past 400 years, that the Russians were the only ones who actually presented something of a viable civilization alternative. Like you could imagine a Russian-led Europe, for example. Uh, you can't imagine a Chinese-led even today. as economically powerful as they might be, as much global reach as they might have, you cannot imagine conceptually a Chinese-led Europe. At least I can. But if a number of factors were to change, you could very realistically see a Europe, maybe that's not Russian-led, but a Europe where Russia is an active player and that they are one of the decision makers on the continent. And that's
Mm.
something they do not want, especially when other countries on the continent, say Germany in particular, get more comfortable with the idea of cooperation with Russia. And we've seen the results of that. We saw what happened when Bismarck tried to reconcile with Russia back in late 1800s, early 1900s. And as a more recent example, we saw the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yes. And they've almost caught the Nord Stream pipeline guy who blew it up.
Uh,
Have you heard the latest? It's just ridiculous.
oh, do
So
tell.
apparently this guy, so he took a car from I think the Ukrainian embassy in Poland, and he drove around with his family. He went to Denmark and Germany, Hamburg, like he had a vacation. Like
Yeah, it's what you do.
apparently they want his arrest, but um but not that much. And then he escaped from Poland into Ukraine, and no one can find the guy. Like I mean, the story is so cockamamie. It's so ridiculous. That I mean, again, it's a simulation, right? It's a narrative-based simulation, and the Western audience falls for it every time. Um, there's, I don't know. It's hopeless.
No, there's just a certain percentage of the Western audience that you can just write off because they're not going to be convinced
Yeah,
until the media narrative changes that they're just going to take their marching orders and that they're just going to
yeah,
take the bait hook, line, and sinker, and that maybe one day, if we're lucky, if we want to be optimistic, and people who think like us are in control of those media apparatuses, they'll start making sense. But until that day comes, they're going to eat what's put in front of them. They're going to be like goldfish about this, and they're going to have the memory capacity of a goldfish about this, and that's how it's just going to continue. Once again, it's not even necessarily a moral condemnation of these people. That's just the way a lot of these people function, and I think that that's just inherent, and that's just who they are. And like I said, the only way to convince those people is you take care of the important stuff and they follow. I'll just put it that way.
yeah,
And uh, that's a Herculean task if there ever was one. But I suppose that being said, because we are pushing 2.5
mhm.
hours, just wrap up with some brief Middle Eastern news. So just to confirm
Yeah, yeah.
once
I was
again,
thinking the same thing.
there is 1/3 of the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf positioned against Iran, yet not a single aircraft carrier, mind you. And that is because the Iranian anti-ship missiles, the Iranian military capacity, are able to sink an aircraft carrier. And you look at American naval strategy post 1945, when we are more or less uncontested. The closest thing is the Soviet Union, which has a formidable submarine fleet. But the main threat of the Soviet Union to American hegemony came from a hypothetical land invasion of Western Europe. That is the threat that the Soviet Union presented. They had the submarines to keep Western navies at bay in order to, like I said, facilitate their ground operations. But in terms of any great naval capacity, the Soviet Union did not have that. So Western strategy from 1945 onward has been the guarantor of the global seas, and the aircraft carrier has been vital in that. You look at a lot of the interventions that we've conducted post Cold War, whether that be in Afghanistan, Iraq, even the Horn of Africa when it came to combat operations against, say, the Somali pirates, or during the Iran-Iraq War when we engaged in skirmishes against the Iranians in order to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, or when it comes to our posturing against China in the South China Sea before China's naval buildup of its own, because China has invested greatly in its navy in the past 30 years. The aircraft carrier has been vital in terms of a power projection tool when it comes to a country that dominates global seas. It is a tool that maintains power projection, but it is. We've long evolved since World War II when it comes to naval warfare strategies, where the aircraft carrier is not something you're going to use against a peer or near peer navy, and especially with the advent of missiles, because they're sitting ducks. They were arguably sitting ducks during World War II. Now, uh, it's nowhere near the same situation as today. Once again, they were big, slow moving targets that carried a lot of manpower and a lot of equipment. And now that we have missiles that can fulfill many of the same role as a lot of these aircraft, they can't completely replace them. And these same missiles that can actually sink these vessels, they've become a liability in many theaters. So the absence of U.S. aircraft carriers is not even bog standard military incompetence that you've come to expect from the United States in the past 15, 20 years. It actually is a very deliberate move. And they have also been staying about, I think, I can't remember the exact range, but they've been staying outside of Iranian anti-ship missile range because they don't want to risk engagement. But the fleet is arrayed around Iran, near the Gulf of Aden, of course, out of range of the Houthis because they don't want to risk anything with that. Even though the Houthis have hit some merchant vessels heading towards Europe under European flags just in the past few weeks as well. And I think they actually did manage to sink one of them. And but you do have this posturing of the U.S. fleet where it is there, but they are keeping their distance because they don't want to escalate. They just want to project force, and they also fear the potential for retaliation because while you can look at the objective numbers, while you can look at the military capacity, yes, objectively speaking, if America were willing to commit itself to a total war, it could win a conventional conflict against the Iranians. But the Iranians know, the Pentagon knows, everyone knows that the American public, and not even the American government or the Pentagon, are willing to sustain the losses it would take for a direct confrontation with Iran. And that even going back to 2003, we can talk about the Millennium Challenge 2002, 2003, Iranian anti-ship capabilities have the potential to more or less sink the entire Fifth Fleet that would normally be in the Persian Gulf, which, like I said, why once again they're even keeping their distance from that. Still within a range of Iran, but keeping their distance from that. And Iranian capabilities have only increased. They're receiving more military shipments from Russia, less so from China, but it still is happening. And this is all during Blinken's visit to the Middle East, trying to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, which, of course, is for the sake of the election. I didn't cover anything from the DNC because, let's be honest, who cares? I argued not even covering things from the RNC, but I do think. Now, I don't think it's aged very well, but I do think at the time, just objectively, politically speaking, Trump made the right move when it came to his speech electorally. We could do an autopsy on that sometime, but
Mm.
that's not really my point here. But point being, in the lead up to the election, with a lot of the left wing factions in the United States who are on the fence about the current Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, and her policy towards the Middle East, particularly Gaza, Blinken is over there in his last ditch effort trying to secure some sort of peace deal. So, just a brief timeline of things that have happened within the past couple weeks. August 19th, Blinken went to Israel and met with Netanyahu, and he claimed that Netanyahu accept a quote unquote proposal to have a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. The next day, on the 20th, he visited Egypt where he talked with Al Sisi, and Sisi told Blinken that the time to end the Gaza war is now, and warned him about the consequences of the conflict spreading across the region. And Sisi has been in the very precarious situation where he has to keep the Egyptian population, which is overwhelmingly pro-Palestine, of course, at bay, while also not risking open conflict with Israel and disrupting the post-1979 status quo. So Sisi has the almost impossible task of maintaining order both inside of Egypt and peace with Israel, or relative peace with Israel, I should say. Because, I mean, it takes just a few swift political moves in Egypt to escalate the situation into a regional war in the other direction, not even including the Iranians. And mind you, the Egyptians, even Sisi's government, have hosted IRGC representatives within the past 2 months. So there is a tightrope being walked there. But Blinken was over there begging Sisi and trying to say, "Don't worry, we're committed to a Gaza ceasefire. We're not going to let this conflict spread." And then after that, he went to Qatar to meet with Thani, who is the Emir of Qatar. Um, but it turned out to only be a phone call conversation because Thani claimed that he wasn't feeling well. Now, how much of that's an excuse, how much of that is just political posturing, I don't know. Then, in exchange, Blinken ended up meeting with the Qatari Foreign Minister Khulafi, who confirmed that Qatar was dedicated to help mediate a resolution in Gaza. Mind you, Qatar is the official host of Hamas, at least the political wing of Hamas. And then Blinken topped it off with a phone conversation with the foreign minister of Turkey, Fidan, about his Middle Eastern trip and in efforts to broker a ceasefire. So he talked to more or less all the major players in the Middle East. You'll notice Jordan was absent because they have no role in this conflict. The Jordanians are pushovers that any relevance they once had has been completely erased. But Blinken tried to smooth over his brief visit to the Middle East with a phone call that really didn't amount to much. Of course, you still have the Pentagon posturing that the Iranians are going to strike any day now, and you have this standoff continuing, in which case, the longer it waits, the more substantial of an Iranian retaliation we're probably going to see. And to what extent those strikes will be, what those strikes will be targeted at, I don't know. But at the same time, you've had the Israelis respond to the tensions in the region by increasing strikes on Syria, where during this week there were strikes on Homs airport in Syria, there were strikes in Hama, and there were strikes in Lebanon as well, and
Hmm.
as well as Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. So not much has shifted in the Middle East. Um, as I mentioned before, there were some Houthi operations in the Red Sea that those have been continuing. And also, Israel continues to stifle the peace process by denying Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, from visiting Gaza. But probably the funniest thing this week was the 45-hour incursion into the West Bank by the IDF, where
Yeah, yeah.
where they drummed it up as this big operation that they were going to go in, they were going to clear out the elements of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is the alleged Iranian affiliate within the West Bank, whereas Hamas operates out of Gaza. Uh, so they went in, they did some clearing operations, they allegedly arrested some PIJ members, but the operation was abruptly ended after 45 hours, not even 48 hours, 45 hours, because I think while the Western world has no problem with what's happening in Gaza, at least the leadership, they can tolerate that. An attack on the West Bank, where the Israelis have, at least on the surface, made a commitment to peace and a two-state solution. Now, the Knesset has gone back on that, but where the understanding diplomatically is Israel is supposed to be working with the Palestinian Authority on some sort of two-state solution, raids into the West Bank are even too bad of optics for Netanyahu in the West, and that they had to cease the operation, and also the much more real fact they can't fight a two-front war. Not that there's really much resistance in the West Bank. PIJ is kind of a joke, especially compared to Hamas. That they aren't a proper military wing of a political party that could actually wage a fight against Israel. And even just talking about geography, talking about the disposition of the West Bank, the number of settlements, any out and open war between any group in the West Bank and Israel proper would be a much shorter operation than Gaza, because Gaza is much more fortified. Hamas has had time to actually build the tunnel networks. Now I know there's tunnel networks within the West Bank as well, but as it stands, the West Bank is effectively under Israeli control, and more of it comes under more direct Israeli control via settlements every year, and nothing about that's going to change. Abbas, at best, is a lame duck at worst, an outright puppet of the Israelis, which I lean towards the latter, frankly. But even with all of those factors, they still could not sustain an operation, even 48 hours in the West Bank.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just a couple of things. I don't know if our audience knows about Blinken, right? So, of course, he set the tempo for just a successive um, list of failures to reach a ceasefire in Gaza when he visited for the first time last year after October 7th, and he said, I come here not only as an
First as a
American.
Jew, second as the Secretary of State of the United States.
Exactly, right. And then he started, of course, what did he do? He went after sympathy points because his father fled from one concentration camp after another. I don't recall whether he eventually died in the war or not, but
His
you know
stepfather
his
was liberated by the African tank crews, and he kissed the feet and praised
it,
America. That
see I that's conflicting. I thought it was one of his fathers, stepfather or biological, was actually liberated by the Soviets. But the thing is okay, is both his fathers were avowed Zionists. Both of them wrote articles and donated money and the such. Like, well, one of them wrote articles, but both of them were avowed Zionists. They weren't just like that. Just wasn't a political position, but everything else about their lives was I don't know, bland and uninteresting. Um, no, they were political activists, right? So just so people understand some context. And so with him going to Israel and saying all of that up front, basically what he's doing is he's signaling to the Israelis that you can do whatever. Look, we have to have the pretense that we're going to try to stop you, but we're not, right? Because your co-ethnics run this country anyway. Um, that's why he said what he said, and now it's acceptable parlance because the entire West is inundated with the Holocaust narrative, right? So nothing sounds out of the ordinary. Oh, I would have said the same. You can imagine a normie saying, "I would have said the same thing." Well, the fact is you and him are not the same. He's a friggin' diplomat, right? It's not about his personal feelings.
I
I'm
mean,
sorry,
compared to
but it's
compared to
not.
Kissinger's most famous or infamous quote, "We're conducting foreign policy, not a synagogue."
Yes,
And that's not
that's
even a full
beautiful.
throated defense of Kissinger, but it does show uh, the level of, I guess, for lack of a better word, realism on his part versus just the complete ideological bent of American foreign policy in 2024.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm correcting you or not, but I might have misheard you, but there's not a single aircraft carrier in the Asia Pacific at the moment.
Um, in I thought the way I read the reports, and perhaps I misread it, and maybe you're right here, that they don't have an aircraft carrier positioned against the Iranians despite having fleet positions against them. But it
Well,
may
they're in the Red Sea
okay. So
and they're in the Eastern Mediterranean, but
yes,
they're not.
yes, you're right.
But they're not in the Asia Pacific. Like there's just no aircraft carrier around Taiwan, for instance,
Okay,
or near Japan.
you're right. Thank you. What I should have said, because I had misread those reports, is that the aircraft carrier forces from the Asia Pacific were diverted to the Persian Gulf as part of
Mm.
one third of the U.S. fleet being in postured against the Iranians, whether in the Persian Gulf or in the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, but I had read that as they have one third of the fleet there, but no aircraft carriers. And I thought it was conspicuous, but I also thought, yeah, it may. What are they not willing to risk the white elephant? Which, uh, it's a real damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you have these things within range of actually being sunk, but also if you don't put them there, you admit there's a vulnerability there. But what you said makes a lot more sense. So, Retroactively modify my previous statements, please, for those of you who have made it this far into the show, and my apologies in advance for that. But well, in retrospect for that, but I think you get the point here.
Yeah, yeah,
But I mean, worse yet, no aircraft carriers in the Asia Pacific where realistically, when it comes to posturing against China, it would make more sense. I don't know. Perhaps they feel that the Chinese hypersonic missiles would be too much of a threat to the carriers. No, I don't think that's actually it. But once again, we are talking significant advances in anti-ship missiles. But on that note, you also have Sullivan in his visit to China,
hmm
which looked absolutely pathetic as he was shaking Xi Jinping's hand. This did not look like the meeting of a representative of the United States government with the foreign head of state. This looked like it. People compare. This looked like Xi Jinping's intern shaking his hand.
yeah,
And that's what that image exuded from Sullivan. And the purpose of his trip, he met with Xi and he met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and the particulars of the discussion that they had was once again on the surface hammering out peace in Ukraine because the Chinese have postured themselves as a mediator in the Ukrainian conflict, and of course the U.S. also officially has to take that position, as we all know that they are full-throatedly behind Ukraine. So Sullivan was in China discussing that, but he was also at the same time trying to put pressure on the Chinese to uh, cooperate more with the sanctions regime against Russia, and that failed. They more or less told him to his face it's not happening, and these negotiations are at an impasse, which has been whether it's been Blinken in China, whether it's been Sullivan in China. I think they even sent Janet Yellen to China once. It,
yes, they
that
did.
that has been the summary of all of those meetings. Uh, just is simply not going to happen.
Yeah,
All the meetings post Ukraine, and that has been seemingly our main focus with our diplomatic relations toward China. Probably the worst one of those is when Blinken didn't even bother to leave China before denouncing Xi Jinping as a dictator. But th- this is what we've come to expect from American diplomatic officials, and don't I mean those of you who've been listening to the show long enough, I wouldn't extend more courtesy to say Mike Pompeo or John Bolton. They got plenty of criticism on the show for those of you who were around in 2019, 2020. So make no mistake, I'm not being partisan here. But while what they did was incompetent, while what they did was completely not aligned with what I would say, they exude competence compared to what we see right now. They could at least have a face of competence. Mike Pompeo at least received the welcome of a diplomat when he went places. And like I said, that's no credit to Mike Pompeo. I do not like the man. I think he is one of the worst parts from the first Trump administration, both in his role as CIA director and Secretary of State. And John Bolton, need I say any more? But like I said, the amount of decline that we've seen between U.S.-Chinese cooperation between the two administrations, and even if Trump comes back into power, I think we've made our position on Trump 2024 very clear at this point. I don't expect much change. There might be some stronger posturing. Whoever Trump throws in as Secretary of State might look a bit more serious. But once again, it's going to reach these same impasses over and over. In fact, it might be more hostile if we listen to Trump's rhetoric. If we are to believe that he's actually going to complete the pivot towards Asia that has been speculated for a number of years, going all the way back to Obama. Ironically enough, the Russians did their own pivot to Asia before the United States could ever complete theirs. I just want to point that out.
yeah.
I just want to point that out in light of the Ukraine war. But while yes, there's plenty of criticism to go around for the particular officials of the Biden administration, I do think this is just the new normal between U.S. and Chinese relations because the global situation and the situation in those two countries has degraded to this.
Yeah,
And like I said, even under a more competent administration, I just don't think that there would be any breakthroughs that we would keep reaching the same impasses. Uh, because what is there left to discuss between the U.S. and China if the United States continues this line where China has to be completely hemmed in? And once again, I want to look at this completely objectively, not taking a pro-China stance, not taking an anti-China stance, asking you to set aside whatever biases you might have about China. But when you have the United States there, when Japan is effectively a military base for them, the Philippines is not far behind. South Korea, home to a large number of U.S. ground forces, posturing against North Korea, which is the buffer state between China and those U.S. land forces. Continued cooperation with Vietnam, and also attempts Thailand as well. Thailand is a longtime U.S. Asset in the region, as well as cooperation with other countries in the Asia Pacific, and more or less a stated policy of having the ability to choke the Chinese off from the Strait of Malacca if the need were to arise. What recourse are the Chinese supposed to have? What are they supposed to negotiate about
Hmm.
if China can't have their backyard? And like I said, these countries might not like China. They might prefer cooperation with the United States. But at what point does the U.S. look at this pragmatically and realize what diplomatic progress can we make with China if these are all of our demands and we aren't going to budge on any of these? And like I said, I went over this last week. Even public opinion in some of these countries is softening towards China, not necessarily because of love of the nation or the people itself, but because of the ever increasing demands of the U.S. And I do think that Ukraine has woken up a lot of these countries that would have otherwise aligned itself with the United States because the price of American allyship, the way you have to prove yourself, is the kind of war Ukraine is conducting. If the situation were to, let's just take Vietnam for example, because they share a direct land border with China. If the situation were to boil over and the U.S. was to expect Taiwan to hold its ground against the Chinese in some sort of hypothetical crisis that did lead to a ground war, would the Vietnamese be expected to fight like the Ukrainians? Yeah, probably, from the perspective of the United States, and that they would wage this kind of war as well. And these countries that are thinking that would have thought about potentially aligning themselves with the United States realize that in many ways that allyship is just becoming cannon fodder.
Yeah. I mean, great points. You've definitely thought about this region more than I have.
I've been trying
Uh,
to make up for the lost time because like between Ukraine and then of course Gaza, Israel, everything like that happening. I know we used to talk about China and Asia a lot more on the show, and
yeah,
it's an important region. I feel like, and I'm not blaming you. I'm not even blaming myself here, but I feel like just by circumstance it has been neglected. So I'm trying
yeah,
to put this at the end of the show in order to just keep this at the forefront of our minds.
yeah, yeah. No, I think it's important. I have wondered, however, that Sullivan visiting China, like sometimes I think, more conspiratorially, and I think like, they're moving their carriers because I mean, look, China's not going to. We've said this many times. China's not going to invade Taiwan. I don't think. I mean, I could be proven wrong later, but
I mean, they took Hong Kong without a drop of blood, and I know Taiwan is much bigger; it's much more strategically significant. But
yeah,
even in terms of pro-Beijing factions in Taiwan, they are there, and they do they do well in elections. They haven't won. They didn't win the last presidential election. I think that was mostly due to internal issues within Taiwan versus any foreign policy issues. Trade volume between the mainland and Taiwan is up. I think I I think it's up like 200 billion from 2018 in this past 6 years. And as the West becomes a less reliable partner, you may see this. And from what I've been told from some people I know who know a little bit more about China than myself, there actually has been some soft rehabilitation of Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT in mainland China, where they are, in my opinion, trying to make overtures to Taiwan in terms of a potential diplomatic reunification, if not just potential diplomatic cooperation, where they are softening their stances. Where, as we know, especially since the death of Mao, when it comes to a lot of the policies of the Communist Party of China, whether that be economically or socially. They have taken a much different direction, and they have in many ways become a somewhat nationalist regime. I don't want to say entirely, and economically speaking, they resemble more the mixed economies of, say, Germany and Italy in the 1930s. Not entirely, but definitely much more so than, say, the traditional planned economy that you expect from a communist state. So you have had these reforms on the mainland, uh, coupled with back channel diplomacy with Taiwan. And as far as I see it, especially as the West falters, especially as they become less of a guarantor of security, what I see long term for Taiwan is diplomatic reunification. Unless there's some sort of major internal crisis in China that collapses the current regime and leads to yet another revolution. I mean, once again, we're talking about the Communist Party of China has managed to stave off revolution much for longer than really any government in modern Chinese history. It managed to stave off revolution, civil war. So it has been an impressive feat of maintaining stability on the mainland, in an otherwise very volatile country. And I do think if this progress continues, there will come a point, especially if the West does continue to decline, which I have no reason to believe that it won't, especially diplomatically, that there won't be some sort of even soft reintegration between the two. Maybe not even officially. Maybe, like I said, there's a number of different ways this could work out, but I don't see China having Taiwan outside of its orbit for that much longer into the far future. Let's just say the next few decades here. And I mean, I think the trade volume says it all. The fact that these countries still are some of each other's largest trading partners. Am I supposed to believe that these are two countries that are, and once again, question, Taiwan country, separatist province, whatever. Am I supposed to believe that these two polities, let's just say for the sake of absolute objectivity, are really that at odds with each other?
Hmm. The other thing, just to shift very quickly to the Middle East.
Yes, certainly.
I mean, I think Netanyahu specifically wants this war, right?
Oh, of course.
You're seeing some cracks after purging some of the more moderate members of what essentially is an extremist party, but there's already like I don't know if they're being hyperbolic, but talks of if this keeps going, Israel is going to collapse, and more people are fleeing. The thing is, he wants the war. He wants like um, the Iran threat gone for good, and I think like I mean that's why they would kill Hanania, right? That's the only reason they would do it, is to provoke the Iranians into doing that, because what is happening now for Israeli citizens is it, it is unbearable. They don't have the staying power that Palestinians do. They just don't. They're used to getting their way, but I mean, you have these ridiculous videos of Israelis in the north. They if they hear a siren, it's like they literally say on camera, "I just had the worst day of my life." I mean, literally nothing happened. Um,
And once again,
it-
think about how many of these people hold another passport and could just
yeah,
as easily go back to their job in New York or London or wherever.
yeah,
They have an easy out, just as much as say the diaspora in other parts of the world have an easy out to Israel or did say before October 7th or before the recent bout of tensions. They just as easily have the easy out to wherever. And despite complaints from the diaspora, despite complaints from wherever about alleged anti-Semitism in X, Y, or Z, they'll still go back. They have their communities.
yeah, yeah.
They have the place. That's it, once again, it's all hand wringing, as we all know. But going back to your point about Netanyahu, he has to realize that the window for an American-led regime change against the Iranians is rapidly closing, especially with demographic change in the United States, the dying off of the boomer generation, who are, whether through theological or political reasons, are the most dedicated to the Israeli cause and can't imagine a world without Israel, whereas there's more apathy, if not outright hostility, from younger generations of the United States, especially, and a large part of that, yes, is demographic change. And also when it comes to just American military capability and the growing tensions in both Europe and the Asia Pacific that draw the attention of the United States as well. Netanyahu realized, I think he realized this all the way back during the first Trump administration, and even before then, back during, say, the Iran deal, late Obama era, that within the next decade, within the next 15, 20 years, it's going to be a now or never moment uh, if we want to answer the Iranian question once and for all. And especially now that the Iranians have made diplomatic overtures to Saudi Arabia and to many of the Gulf states, and as I said, even some backdoor deals with Egypt, as well as further cooperation with Russia and China, two major powers that can integrate it back onto the world stage in a position it hasn't been since before the Iranian Revolution. It is a do or die moment for the Israelis if they want to solve the Iranian question, if they want to eliminate their biggest rival, because their biggest rival is once again being accepted at least to part of the world stage, and uh, the guarantor of their security is rapidly losing the ability, both in terms of justifying a war effort and maintaining a war effort, to take out their greatest adversary. So Netanyahu needs, not only for his own political career, of course he wants it for his own political career to justify himself staying in power, but for the sake of the Israeli state, not only Netanyahu but other factions within Israel as well, see this as the Iranians need to go down because the world is accepting them again, and we can't have that. We can't have our rival. And if we were to conduct ourselves like a normal state, we might actually have to make concessions, which we know damn well the Israelis not willing to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, time is running out for them. They know. Look, the Israelis need to become like the biggest, baddest presence in the Middle East before they lose the kind of support that they enjoy so well in the U.S. You know.
And it is a bit funny because during Netanyahu's previous tenures in office, whether that was in, say, the late 90s, early 2000s, or when he came back into office in the mid 2000s into the 2010s, he did make diplomatic overtures to Russia and China. He was trying to not put all of his eggs in one basket. Then he gets removed from office. You have Bennett, who gradually erodes that. Now, Bennett, I suppose to credit, he did try to mediate peace between Ukraine and Israel, Ukraine and Russia. Excuse me, Ukraine is, but between Ukraine and Russia. But then you had what Lapid, who was the replacement for that, who was from the more center right faction, who burned bridges with Russia and China. And who knows? Had Lapid not done that, the response from Russia and China to the current Gaza war might look a little different
Mhm.
if Netanyahu still had the ability to go to Moscow like he did many times in his previous terms in office. If he had the ability to even go to Beijing, uh, the conflict could take a much more could have taken a much more measured approach. Now, who knows? Just given Russia and China's reputation in the region and also their personal interest, they may have pressured him not to go as hard into Gaza or whatever else, and that might have mitigated this conflict. But once again, mostly thanks to actually Netanyahu's immediate successors post 2022, uh, their bridges with non-Western powers are burned, so now he has to rely entirely on the United States and the West, which are rapidly declining. In which case, on top of his own internal scandals that he has to stave off prison, has to stave off any sort of corruption charges against him and his family, but he also has to rely on this increasingly declining power bloc to solve the issue of their greatest rival, which the United States has no diplomatic relations with. Which, I mean, I think part of the reason things were kept at bay for so long is the fact that, yeah, Netanyahu could go to Moscow and he could talk to Russia about the situation with Syria and Iran. And Russia, um, because of whatever Israeli interests or interest in stability in the region, could pull the leash on Syria and Iran occasionally if the situation got out of control. But once again, those bridges were burned. And when was the last time Netanyahu was in Moscow? 2019.
Mm, I would think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds
I
right.
think it was before COVID. Once again,
Yes.
and you can go back to our shows in 2018, 2019. That pretty much every time we went to Moscow, it was because the situation in Syria was intensifying, and by extension, the situation in Iran was intensifying, and he was trying to negotiate more or less with Syria and Iran through Russia in order to keep the situation at bay. Because yeah, he wanted the threat of those two, but he didn't want to actually commit to the bit. But now that he doesn't have the back channel diplomacy with them through the Russians, he has to commit to the bit.
Yes.
And that's my ultimate take on it. I do think that probably the stupidest thing Israel did under Lapid was burn those bridges with non-Western powers because, like I said, not that Russia and China would have been like gung ho pro-Israel like you've seen within the United States and some other Western countries, but they could have been a much more mediating force. Whereas both of them had just said Israel's gone too far this time, and they're acting like a ridiculous country. We can't abide by this, and perhaps that was the downfall. And like I said, Netanyahu, to his credit, early on, at least had the foresight to realize Israel needed to diversify its investments, for lack of a better term. But with that little pivot back to the Middle East, that's really all I had for this episode. Is there anything that we left out?
uh, I don't think so.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report, and we will see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.